Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku confessed the nightmares that almost ended him? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Hey all. So I'm listening to sad music, and I figured, why the hell shouldn't I post a sad one-shot? That's really the only inspiration behind this. So tonight, cause it's 3:27 a.m. as I begin writing this, we'll be doing an extremely common variation of Midoriya having a nightmare, and people appear. I originally contemplated with doing Midoriya interacting with someone with a quirk that forced him to be honest, or maybe even having a nightmare during the day, daymare, but ultimately, those felt cheap. Like, prospective students aren't going to be randomly assaulted, especially because it's cited canonically that people recognize the UA students. Like, if your quirk is telling people to be truthful, you're probably and I'll try to quote Bakugo here, a shitty wannabe villain punk-ass motherfucker. I did see one super amazing FIC though by 7 Rennie, named Scorpions and Chains. Check it out, it's seriously great. Anyways, so yeah, we'll be doing just a typical nightmare setting. It'll be handspun a bit to make it a bit more believable, but I didn't want to use my original idea, because I'm saving it for my other story, and I would hate to reuse ideas. Onto shipping. So this'll be awkward, but honestly, there's maybe a ship you could take from this, but maybe not. I won't tell you who is being shipped, because I'll leave it to you guys, but I'm also going to have people interact how I think they would if this actually happened. So yeah, no flaming and shit, and enjoy. Oh yeah, and this might be a little sad. Sorry, but it'll be fluffy too. Maybe. Spoilers for chapter 144 onward. Izuku Midoriya was no stranger to nightmares, contrary to the popular belief that he was just a happy-go-lucky, slightly nerdy, innocent little cinnamon roll. Because of his own personal paranoia, the green-haired wielder of One for All had made the decision to withhold his own history from his friends of Class 1A, and for the most part, they were none the wiser. Most of the students simply chalked it up to the same reason they didn't share anything from their time in middle school. It was relatively boring, and if anything did happen, they preferred to keep it somewhat buried in the depths of their mind. Unless anyone specifically asked, there was nothing to specifically tell. But for Midoriya, he wasn't lucky enough to have had just a plain, boring middle school experience. With his circumstances, honestly, it should have been as plain as they came, but apparently, being a plain person did not equate to having plain days. Being on the receiving end of some rather vicious bullying, Midoriya began to wear the scars mentally, as well as physically, though he had no idea they were forming. It started with the sudden flinching when anyone reached toward him. Inko was horrified at first, but after some rather skittish remarks and pleading, along with some rational deception, she'd come to believe the flinching was due to his inheriting of her nature. After all, he was around her all day, so it only made sense that he'd pick up on a few things, and she knew she wasn't the textbook example for courageous. The flinching only became worse at school, but his classmates were practically kids, still. They didn't particularly understand mental trauma, and for that matter, neither did Midoriya. He just figured it was like a response to being involved in a lot of fights. Which he wasn't wrong, per se. The stuttering began after Bakugo began making it a habit to cut off Midoriya mid-sentence in an effort to establish dominance over him. If there had been one thing that the blonde despised, it was being outdone. And Midoriya was smart. His brain was the only thing that let him stand out in a class of imbeciles, in Bakugo's mind, so it became the blonde's personal mission to interrupt the green-haired boy at every chance. Other bullies picked up this habit, and soon enough, Midoriya's skittish nature included a stutter that stemmed from not only fear of rejection, but also the thought that no one cared what he had to say. At night, young Midoriya began having his dreams of being All Might Jr. turn into visions of Bakugo and other bullies pummel him, and his mother expressing disappointment in him. The first few times, he was terrified, and regularly made sure his mother was not disappointed in him. Once he was sure they were fake, he began ignoring them to the best of his ability, and soon enough, they just became a semi-regular thing, just like his flinching and stuttering. Once he got to you, however, things began to change. He made friends. The bullying stopped. He had a quirk. But most of all, people paid attention to him. Which, at first, was revolutionary. But that all quickly morphed into fear as they began to see right through his carefully crafted facade that he hadn't even meant to create. It wasn't as if he was pretending to be timid or acting shy. He was genuinely a shy person, thanks largely in part to his lack of friendly interaction. But his facade of pretending to be okay, convincing both himself and others that there was nothing bothering him, it quickly began to crumble away. People began to see through it. And his belief that Bakugo hadn't been a bad person also began to erode. He'd forgiven Kaken, really, he couldn't hold a grudge anyways, so he didn't pretend to try, but that didn't mean he could keep Kaken from hating his guts, nor could he stop people from speculating. Speculation could be deterred by behavior that disproved such thoughts, however, and that became Midoriya's primary goal when people snooped around. And it went great for a while. That is, until he'd been invited over to Yaoyorozu's mansion. Following most of everyone passing the provisional hero licensing exam, Yaoyorozu decided to hold a small celebration for everyone to come and enjoy themselves as the members of Class 1A could party in honor of their large step forward in their lives toward becoming heroes. Of course, Bakugo had turned down the offer immediately, and frankly, there was no one that was opposed to that. Even Kirishima was pleased, though he'd admitted he did wish his explosive friend was able to come at one point during the night. Todoroki, admittedly, passed up the opportunity, if only because he didn't wish to cloud the atmosphere with his thoughts. Midoriya tried to convince him otherwise, as did Yaoyorozu and Minut, but he respectfully declined, and stated he needed to think about things involving his father, as well as visit his mother again. While it was unfortunate, Midoriya understood, and even he admitted to himself that he'd hate to attend a party for something he failed to do. Everyone else, however, was more than excited to have a night to just be teenagers for a change. Even Mineta was invited, though Yaoyorozu was very straightforward with how he was to behave, lest he want to be forcefully removed. The night went off without a hitch, and everyone enjoyed themselves immensely, and found themselves interacting with classmates they didn't typically interact with. Once the night came, Yaoyorozu informed everyone they could pair up into small groups and find a guest room, but Siro and Hagakure both were adamant on everyone spending the night together, like one big sleepover. The idea went well, and within a few minutes, everyone was settling into their blanket and eagerly chatting away with whomever their nighttime neighbor was. Strangely, or not, depending on who you asked, Mineta was stuck between Aoyama and Shoji, something he was not happy with, but nobody was willing to move, to his disappointment. One by one, everyone fell into the waiting arms of dreamland, except for one. Of all nights, sporadic as they were, Midoriya found himself trapped within the cold clutches of a relentless nightmare, and in the real world, he began to shuffle fitfully in his rest, stirring a few of his nearby classmates. Midoriya's a real wild guy. He even fights in his sleep, Kirishima muttered, gently rubbing his eyes with his forearm. He'd learned his lesson about using his hand, and he had the scar to prove it. How manly can you get? I doubt he's fighting, Ashido said, rolling onto her stomach to get a look at the bushy-haired teen, struggling futilely in his rest. While she was partially annoyed to be woken, she hardly blamed Midoriya once she'd seen the state he was in. Part of her was tempted to try and stir him from his slumber, but she also knew how well that went when she'd once woken her brother, and knowing Midoriya and his massive power, she decided to let him ride it out. A yawn escaped Hagakure's lips, but without the noise that accompanied it, nobody would have known. It looks like he's in pain. I feel like we should help him. Kaminari scoffed. Yeah, you wake up the kid that can destroy a glacier by flicking his fingers. I'm good with living, though. From his position, Kirishima could see the way that Midoriya's brow furrowed, as if he was trying to block out bad thoughts, and the way his arms tightened around his sheets. The red-haired teenager frowned, and felt the temptation arise to try and wake up his classmate. Out of anyone, he was the best suited to do so, but he also wasn't sure how suited he was. You know, it looks like a pretty bad nightmare. Hagakure thought aloud. I didn't know Midoriya had nightmares. Everyone has nightmares, Hagakure. The tired, but patient voice of Yaoyorozu broke through the darkness, and through the shadows, One could make out the taller girl leaving the comfort of her blankets to come over to where Midoriya was tossing and turning. She knelt down nearby him and produced a small fan from her abdomen and turned it on, before placing it near his head in an effort to cool him down. It's just a natural reaction to stress and fear. I know that. Hagakure defended, drawing a snort from Ashido. So you did? Even in the darkness, Hagakure was able to reach over and smack Ashido lightly on the arm, causing a quiet yelp to escape from Ashido when she felt her arms suddenly touched. What do you think he's dreaming about? Kaminari said suddenly. Everyone went quiet. The answer could have been a multitude of things, truthfully. I cannot say for certain, but I have had a nightmare about Stain. Ida's voice was sudden and unexpected, so a few students jumped at the sound of his usually booming voice. But now it was quiet and small. It was so unlike the Ida everyone was used to. At first, it was because of my brother, but after a few nights, it was the look in his eye that I dreamt of. Ida knew he couldn't tell anyone about the true results of the altercation and outcome he, Todoroki and Midoriya had been part of, but he hadn't withheld the fact that they'd all encountered the hero killer. In fact, none of them had. Mina exhaled gently. Sometimes, I have nightmares about my parents getting hurt by a villain because of my journey toward becoming a hero. There were a few mumbles that went around the room as those awake admitted they'd likely had the same nightmare at some point, and even thought about it during the waking hours of the day. Becoming a hero meant putting your family in danger, and nobody was particularly sure on how to deal with that facet of a hero's life. Aizawa had yet to cover that aspect of heroics, but when he did, everyone was going to be listening. From the darkness, Kaminari spoke. I once had a nightmare about Bakugo. Someone, who, exactly, was unknown, snorted in a failed attempt to withhold their laughter, causing Kaminari to lash out. Hey, it's not funny. He's scary. Yaoyorozu shushed him gently. Come now, there's people trying to sleep. Let's be respectful of them. The electricity user grumbled quietly, but obliged by Yaoyorozu's request, despite his reluctance to quiet down. Surprisingly, Hagakure spoke up and agreed. Kaminari makes a good point. He's rather rude, and he really hates Midoriya. That's true. Ashido mumbled. I've never seen someone so kind get treated like such shit. For no reason too. Hey, we can't judge, Kirishima said semi-defensively. We don't know their history. And Bakugo isn't exactly known for being open about his past, huh? Kaminari rolled his eyes in the darkness, knowing full well no one could see him. He's also not known for his kindness. Let's not divulge into gossip. That's rather unbecoming for prospective heroes, wouldn't you agree? Ida said, apparently having enough of the conversation. In all honesty, everyone had been expecting Ida to shut down the conversation earlier. They weren't surprised he decided to take a stand now. He had always been against any sort of gossip, so it wasn't surprising to see him stand against it now. Yaoyorozu created a small candle and lit it near Izuku's body, in an effort to see better and intervene if necessary. Suddenly, as if the light was a catalyst in his nightmare, Midoriya grunted, and his body was enveloped in a red glow, and a pressure descended upon the room, before the glow dissipated, and everyone was left wondering what they'd witnessed. However, he shot upward, grasping forward feebly and clutched at the air, before a guttural roar was unleashed from deep within his throat. Honestly, it would have been a miracle everyone didn't wake up. That was not the case, however, and those that were previously asleep were now desperately trying to find their bearings as they were mercilessly torn from their peaceful dreams. And Midoriya, Kirishima said loudly. It's okay, dude. You're okay. The scenery set in, and memories came flooding back to the green-haired hero, and he felt his stomach churn uncomfortably, in which Kaminari didn't hesitate to point out he was going to spew, resulting in Yaoyorozu creating a trash can for her classmate in haste, just in time as he violently retched into the basket. A few people winced at the force of which Midoriya hurled, and because Yaoyorozu was the closest, she felt the obligation to do something, which resulting in an awkward backrub. Gee guys? Midoriya asked tiredly. The question was open-ended and unspecific, but no one was particularly certain of how to answer their classmate, mostly due to his recent display. More than that, nobody was sure who should speak up. There was no designated caretaker in these situations, and although Uraraka was the closest thing to the Deku help leader, she was still smothered by fatigue and had no clue what was going on. It was clear, however, that Midoriya was becoming more and more anxious, as his jade eyes filled with doubt, concern, but most noticeably, fear. He was afraid he'd done something wrong. Yaoyorozu took the opening with a shade of reluctance. "Midoriya, are you all right?" He blinked groggily, trying desperately to clear the fatigue from his eyes. Aye. He closed his eyes, and there was a sharp intake of breath as he seemingly remembered what it was he was dreaming about. His eyes shot open and he looked shaken as well as visibly nervous. "Why, I'm fine now. Do you want to talk about it?" Hagakure asked kindly. Truth be told, she had no idea of what to do in this situation. Typically, her friends from primary school just spouted whatever was on their mind, and anyone she'd become friends with at UA did something similar. If they remained silent, it was clear that the issue was something bigger than they were ready to share. Midoriya looked around the room uneasily, and the message he was sending was clear: there were too many people. Kirishima took notice and deftly took charge, gesturing to the outside porch where they'd previously held their festives, with his thumb and a grin adorning his face. "Come on, dude, we can talk out there." He studied Midoriya's face, and despite the waver in his look, he still appeared unnerved by the prospect. "If you want. Understandably, there are some secrets we all want to hide." Midoriya glanced over to Ida in surprise. The boy's voice was low, and his eyes were squinting without the use of his glasses, but he seemed much more serious under the dim lighting of the candle. "But, we are your friends. I'm sure we can help if only a little." It took Midoriya only a split second to realize what Ida was implying. Had the engine-quirked student shared his thoughts on his brother, things may have turned out differently. Their lives may have avoided potentially being ended on that fateful night. But then, Stain may not have been captured. Either way, all things considered, being open could only have helped. Midoriya sighed, putting trust in his friends. He needed to do this. Even if they judged him. Okay. But not everyone. He glanced around the room, taking in the tired and confused looks on some of his classmates' faces. "I'll tell them another time." Ida didn't hesitate to stand up and let his booming voice echo throughout the room. "It's all right, everyone. It was just a poor prank. We apologize for waking everyone." Mineta grumbled about being torn from a lewd dream and cast Midoriya a tired glare, while a few other students just blinked, shrugged, gave Ida a strange look, and laid back down in earnest. Uraraka gave Midoriya a worried look, which pulled at his heartstrings. She had been tired out from the day, and Midoriya didn't want to pester her with his problems, so he offered her a weak, but heartwarming smile, which she returned and laid down. "I'll tell her," he reasoned. "On my own account." Slowly, Midoriya stood up and slipped outside, closing a well-decorated glass door behind him whilst everyone else dealt with the fallout of a prank gone awry. For a man that hated lying, Midoriya thought, Ida was a little too good at coming up with fake excuses on the spot. Straight and narrow and hardly deterred from the rules, his engine-quirked friend was fast on his feet, but just as fast on the ball, it seemed. He decided to take a moment to drink in the nighttime air, a stark difference from the warmer, more clustered air inside the room. Grand as it was large, the room didn't exactly have the best circulation, and because of that, the temperature rose higher than anticipated, especially with over a dozen teenagers all cluttered together inside. The sky was polluted with lights, causing the stars to remain hidden from sight, a fact that caused a light frown to slip onto the green-haired boy's face. The moon was masked from sight as well, but more likely, it was due to the cycle of the moon. "It's a nice night, huh?" From behind, Ashido spoke, trying to avoid frightening the jumpy hero in training. He felt a jolt run through his body, and a familiar flicker of power known as One for All surged through his muscles, but he exhaled deeply and pushed the sensation to fight or flee down. He wasn't in danger. There was no one to fight, he told himself. Ashido must have noticed the startled look on his face, because a guilty smile slipped onto her face, and she rubbed the back of her head, though there was little remorse on her face. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I just figured talking was better than touching you or something." He couldn't argue there. Touching him would have probably fried his brain, or sent him into the air with a one-for-all packed leap. Thanks, Midoriya said with a smile, which Ashido returned happily. He could see the curiosity that was bouncing off her expression in waves, but he admired her restraint as she cast her gaze out on the horizon, despite the lack of anything noteworthy to look at. She muttered lowly, "Geez, everyone better hurry up." The two waited patiently for everyone who had been awake for everything to ambulate outside, though Ashido was far less patient than Midoriya. In the end, the group wasn't as large as Midoriya had expected. Kaminari, Kirishima, Yaoyorozu, Ashido, Ida, and Hagakure. It was a good thing she was wearing pajamas, otherwise he wouldn't have known she was there, too. He took a breath in. "So? Just start wherever is comfortable," Yaoyorozu suggested, though judging by the look on her face, she wasn't particularly confident in her thoughts. Kirishima didn't waste any time in positioning himself next to Midoriya, forcing the smaller boy into a sitting position against the wooden railing that kept one from falling off the porch. Everyone nestled in close, Ashido pushing the ever-awkward Yaoyorozu next to Midoriya, who blushed at the close contact, but remained silent. The pink-skinned girl was tempted to slip in between Kirishima and Midoriya, but ended up laying on her back so she could peek at the sky, too. A few quiet seconds passed, and Midoriya still had no idea of where to begin, so he decided to try from the beginning. "Well, I guess you guys should know, I didn't always know my quirk. I only got my quirk a few months before the UA entrance exam." Ida had been right about one thing. There were some secrets he still had to keep. One for all was one of them, for as long as he could keep it, that is. "That's rather late for a quirk to develop," Ida said slowly. Everyone knew the basics of their quirk. It always appeared around when they were 4. Scientists began to rationalize it as something akin to a puberty, as it was a widely regarded fact of when quirks were first noticed in kids. Of course, that didn't prevent outliers from occasionally occurring, but for the most part, it was rather consistent across the world. Hagakure pipped up, recalling a fact from one of their first classes. "And you went to middle school with Bakugo. Is that why he called you quirkless?" Midoriya nodded. "Yeah. I never showed any sign of a quirk in school." Kaken thought I was lying to him. Truthfully, Midoriya had spent hours upon hours, staying awake at night as he considered these little things. He had finally come to the point where he understood why Bakugo hated him so much, and that it all because the ever-prideful teenager thought that Midoriya had just been waiting to overtake him and make him look like a fool. "I guess, see, 'cause of the time I got it, he wasn't really wrong when he called me quirkless. That explains why you always exploded when you used your quirk." Hagakure exclaimed suddenly, causing everyone to sweat drop. Midoriya sighed internally. "At least they buy it," he reasoned. "Alright, because of that? I wasn't the most popular of students." Kirishima's goofy smile had disappeared, and he looked Midoriya straight in the eye. He knew. Even with his hair down, he was still just as intimidating as the first time Midoriya had met the kid, even though he wasn't trying to be. "Bullies. Am I right?" He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Kirishima hadn't seen too many quirkless kids at his school, if any that he could recall. He spared a glance over at Ashido, but judging by her tense frown, she, too, had no experiences with that sort of thing at their school. Ida folded his arms and looked down. His private academy had no such allowance for those without a quirk, even if it was harsh. Kaminari bit his lip. He'd only seen one, and it hadn't ended well for the poor girl. He still remembered the announcement of her passing. She had been 2 years below him, so he didn't know her personally, nor did he really know of her, but he'd been shocked and rather upset to hear of something so tragic happening to someone so innocent. It was a reminder that the world held dark places beyond the borders of his vision. Yaoyorozu said nothing, nor did she allow her feelings to slip onto her face. She was not blind to the statistics, which she suspected everyone else to be unaware of. Hardly could she blame them. They were not friendly numbers. 1 in every 10 quirkless children would commit suicide by the end of their primary schooling. Even less would make it through high school, due mostly in part to the rigors of the high schools and their faux hero departments. UA was not the only heroic school, and most had a similar department, They simply lacked the prestige that UA carried in title alone. If he'd gone through primary school quirkless then. She clenched her eyes shut. The thoughts were not good. It wasn't all bad. I was able to get through because I helped the other kids when I could, and they'd spare me. Midoriya said weakly. The words echoed ominously. They'd spare me. They were sickening words. A wave of anger wrapped its way around the small circle of students as they digested the exact terminology that he'd used. He had to fight for his survival. Hagakure felt her heart aching deep within. Didn't the teachers? Midoriya looked away. They'd see. But more often than not, they wouldn't care. The principal didn't care either? Hagakure asked softly. Midoriya didn't respond. Kirishima clenched his fist and bared his teeth. He knew public schools could be fucked up, but he'd only heard rumors of this sort of thing happening. He'd never believed it actually happened, let alone happen to someone so close to him. And not to someone so kind. They'd spare me? Ashido kept repeating that line over and over in her head, feeling her stomach churn in disgust. She put a hand over her abdomen, trying to quell it. The fact that her classmate, her friend, had to fight for his survival at a place that should have been safe haven was repulsive. Nobody standing up for him, nobody defending him. She blinked, putting her rage on momentary pause. Didn't Bakugo have classes with you? There was an unasked question. Didn't he protect you? But he didn't answer that unasked question. He couldn't. Midoriya flinched lightly, and everyone felt more anger build up within. He wasn't that bad. Sure, he had his moments, but I also bothered him a lot, and if I didn't challenge him all the time? A thud was heard, and everyone turned to Kaminari, who was gritting his teeth in rage. His fist was snugly placed into the wooden flooring, and his body crackled occasionally with loose electricity, causing everyone's hair to stand on edge. That's bullshit. You shouldn't defend him. There's no reason what he did was right. Despite the wild look in his eye, Midoriya sighed, and looked toward his lap, bringing Kaminari's temper down, as the yellow-haired boy looked at him in confusion. I know, what he did was wrong. Beep, he really does want to be a hero, and since that day he hasn't done anything to me. He looked back up, a dim light in the young boy's eyes. In his own Kaken-like way, he respects me now. Ashido snorted. Yeah, emphasis on in his own way. Yaoyorozu, silent for the most of the conversation, gently touched Midoriya's shoulder. She didn't want to abandon the subject of Bakugo and his behavior toward Midoriya, but she hadn't forgotten why they'd come outside in the first place. What was it that you were dreaming about, though? He paled. He had almost forgotten the original reason he'd stumbled outside. Well, the bullies would physically attack me. Midoriya ignored the way everyone tensed up, some in anger and some in shock. But the words could sometimes hurt more. I can heal from a hit. Words take longer to forget. What did they say? Yaoyorozu asked softly. Slowly, he looked up at her and very, very softly he spoke. If I wanted a quirk so badly, I should J-jump. His voice broke, unable to finish the thought, but the implications were set, and a frenzy broke out. Kaminari stood up and snarled, electricity dancing along his body angrily, threatening to lash out at the person that spoke the vile words. Even without the knowledge of who said it, the yellow-haired teen didn't care. He'd just waltzed through Midoriya's former classmates until he found who did. He'd even take on Bakugo if he had to. Ito was shocked. Hollow-faced and silent, he leaned back and stared upward. His time at Somme Private kept him sheltered from people of that caliber. Nearly everyone was the same, and they were drilled to be polite, straightforward, rule-respecting, and earnest. While all these traits belonged to Ida prior to his enrollment, he'd fit right into the program, and as a result, he'd never struggled to meet people. From the time he'd judged Midoriya to the moment he'd become awestruck by the green-haired boy's power, he'd felt bad for the way he'd judged and treated him, but never once had he suspected the boy to be abused in such a way. Nobody deserved that. Kirishima and Ashido were both angry, but not enraged like Kaminari. Perhaps it was because of their anger being more shallow, but spread out in an even way, or maybe it was because he was so angry that they couldn't get as fired up. It didn't matter. Kirishima wanted to knock the lights out of whomever said that, and Ashido wouldn't mind giving them a swift spray of non-lethal acid, maybe even burn it into their clothes to remind them of the things they'd said. Hagakure felt her heart break, and she desperately thanked her quirk's ability to hide her face, because she could roll over and they'd never know she was silently letting tears drip from her eyes. Truly, Midoriya was strange. He was awkward, he was geeky, he was everything that could be odd, but he was so righteous and nice. Even if he wasn't, nobody should be told such heinous things. To know her friend was actively told to end his life was terrifying, honestly. Without thinking, Yaoyorozu leaned over and enveloped the smaller boy in a gentle hug. Maybe it was because of her own awkward ways, or maybe it was because of his own, but this once, Midoriya didn't stiffen or fight off the hug, he just sat still, and though he was beyond surprised, he didn't move or react other than to sniffle once or twice. "We're glad you didn't listen," Yaoyorozu mumbled softly. Her hair, down for a change, draped over Midoriya's shoulder as she pulled him in. She wasn't really sure why she felt obligated to touch him. Maybe it was because she wanted to be certain he hadn't become a number she'd read about. Maybe it was because she wanted to make sure that even though he dreamt it, he had no reason to go through with it. Who knew? She just didn't want him to feel like it was right. Kirishima wrapped an arm around Yaoyorozu and tugged them in close, breathing his anger out in waves. "Listen here, alright? You're our best bud, and no one can take that away. Fuck whoever said that. You're with us now. Quirkless or quirked, we fight for everyone. So next time they say that, give them a punch, and we'll be there to clean up whatever's left. And I'll kick em in the balls," Ashido said a bit too excitedly. While Midoriya had no intention of telling them who said it, he found his heart swelling and a few tears leaking loose from his eyes. "Thanks, everyone." Ida put a hand on Midoriya's shoulder. "You don't have to go forward alone." Despite the fear that shone in Ida's eyes, the class president knew that Midoriya was stronger than almost anyone else, and while Midoriya was passive enough, he wasn't, and he'd sooner knock out the person that said those words than listen to them spoken a second time. "Come, let's go inside. Kaminari's about to fry everyone, and I think Hagakure's gonna need a tissue, or 12, Ashido remarked. Kaminari immediately began protesting, stating how he couldn't believe how anyone would be so inhumane, while Hagakure frantically denied crying that much. All the while, Izuku had to secretly pinch himself to be sure he wasn't dreaming. Because even with the nightmare, having friends like he had now was a dream he wished would never end. This was just a fun little follow-up, nothing too dramatic, just a little practice writing. Hopefully everyone likes it. Focused a tad less on Midoriya, but gave everyone a little something. Enjoy. When dusk struck, it was upon the two representatives from Class 1A to be sure everyone was snugly in bed, or at least, accounted for, safely in their rooms. It wasn't a matter of safety for the students, despite what Ida and Yaoyorozu told everyone, but more of a safety for the two of them, since the later it got, the more unpredictable certain students became. The curfew rule used to just extend toward everyone being located back in the dorms. Thanks to an isolated incident involving Tokoyami and Dark Shadow, Kaminari, and Shoji, along with a less accidental incident involving Mineta, it was decided that everyone needed to be inside their rooms before 11. There were obvious protests at first, however. It only took a few silent rule breakers to begin bending the new curfew in an unintended way. Ashido would be found in Hagakure's room, the two staying up to either hang out later or watch a movie since the common room was off-limits, and eventually other students spied the loophole. To Ida's dismay, even Midoriya took advantage, staying up in Kaminari's room for a video game tourney involving Satu, Siro, and Kirishima. The timid, green-haired boy had only blushed and weakly apologized, though it took all of Ida's willpower to not ask for an invite next time it happened, and judging by the noises he'd hear on some Friday nights, he knew his scolding hadn't exactly dissuaded Midoriya, nor any of the others. Going to the kitchen was the only acceptable reason to be out of your room during the night, and because of that, it began to evolve into the hangout of those with insomnia. Whether it was plaguing nightmares, restless energy, or just the desire to get some water, and maybe sneak a snack, there was always at least one person hanging out at the table, tiredly sipping on water, hoping for the gentle embrace of sleep. That's precisely where Yaoyorozu found herself wandering in the deepest part of the night, as she slipped into a nightgown and fumbled through the dark hallway, half of her mind dedicated toward not falling, while the other half of her brain debated with the idea of creating nighttime lights for the halls, as to prevent them from being so freaking dark. Really though, she could hardly see her feet, let alone what might be hiding on the floor, waiting to trip her up. If she fell, she'd be having a serious word with Aizawa about the design of this place. Once she got to the stair, she exhaled in relief as dim floor lights illuminated the curve of each step, and tread downward, taking care to avoid falling at this point. Straining, she could hear the quiet muttering of at least 2 people in the kitchen, and she snorted. Of course someone was awake at this time. She had doubts that some of her classmates ever slept with how often some of them showed up to class looking like they were zombies. How they were okay with sleeping so little, let alone functioning off such a detrimental amount, was beyond her, but then if it wasn't her problem, she wasn't going to solve it. They were all big kids. They could figure their lives out on their own. Upon reaching the kitchen, the tall, black-haired girl was greeted by the sight of several of her classmates, each hanging around the large kitchen table, surprised by her sudden arrival, but not looking too ashamed as she eyed them warily. Ashido smiled widely, a bit too widely for it being past 1 in the morning, and set down her cup that had steam leaking from the lip of the cup. "Hey, what brings you here, Nightwalker?" she asked kindly. The girl was far too awake right now, Yaoyorozu faintly pondered. But she wouldn't be rude, after all. There was no telling what someone else was thinking or going through. On the surface, Ashido could be acting jubilant, but internally, there was absolutely no guessing what might be raging on. "Just a snack," Yaoyorozu said softly, bring a hand to her stomach. She was sure there was a speckle of red dusting her cheeks, but with the faint glow of the kitchen nightlight, she was sure no one could tell. "What about you all? Is this a regular meetup?" She swept her gaze over the table, taking in everyone's expressions. Tokoyami shrugged, closing his eyes as he did so. From behind him, dark shadow seemed to smirk, although it almost blended in with the shadows that engulfed the room. It was the eyes that kept it clearly visible. Kaminari smiled innocently, while Kirishima just stared into his cup, as if embarrassed. "I'm here too," Hagakure exclaimed. Yaoyorozu blinked. "Are you wearing any clothes?" "Thank you," Kaminari emphasized. "We've been discussing that for like 10 minutes. It's more comfortable to sleep in the nude," Hagakure defended. "You boys won't know, 'cause you're not cultured." "I don't think that's the reason," Kirishima said lightly, scratching at his hair as he said so. "Anyways, it just kinda happened this way. I came down first and saw Tokoyami hanging out by his lonesome, so I asked to join him and here we are." She turned her gaze to Tokoyami. "Oh, I do not sleep well. Dark Shadow is most active at night. And he can be irritating." The last part was spoke with such annoyance, Yaoyorozu was about to make sure she hadn't overstepped a boundary, before Dark Shadow scoffed and crossed his arms. "I just wanted something to do." Tokoyami bristled. "You moving everything around is not doing something. Maybe you should invest in some games, then." "Is he like this every night?" Yaoyorozu couldn't help herself. Honestly, if her quirk was something sentient like Dark Shadow, she had no idea how she'd function, since she'd want to take its considerations into account. Tokoyami sighed. "No, thankfully. It appears that he is influenced by the lunar cycle, though I can't quite identify why that is." He looked back at Dark Shadow, who turned away defiantly, obviously not quite over their little spat, before looking back at the tall girl. Tonight's full moon has him more active than other nights, and because of that, he is restless. And it appears he wants the same for me. "I see," Yaoyorozu admitted with a weak smile. "What about everyone else?" "I just couldn't sleep," Ashido said gleefully. It took most of Yaoyorozu's willpower to avoid commenting a potential hypothesis on why that might be. "Same, although, I guess this is my punishment for staying up all night last night and missing part of class, huh?" Kirishima said, thinking back to the long night of video games he'd indulged in. It had been a bit of a surprise to Yaoyorozu, seeing her red-haired classmate oversleep, since he was usually pretty punctual and got to sleep early enough, but it appeared that she had her answer to his missing presence. Something told her that Kaminari's reason might be coincidentally related, and sure enough, She glanced at him, which he responded to with a sheepish smile. Hagakure, strangely enough, was silent, and didn't seem eager to bring up her reason for being awake. To that, Yaoyorozu understood perfectly. And so, the tall girl would respect Hagakure's privacy, and wouldn't press unless the invisible girl brought it up on her own. Having found everyone's reason for being awake, Yaoyorozu made her way over to the cupboard, and fished out some of her high-calorie snacks courtesy of her parents. When she'd been growing up, her quirk expended more fat than she had available, which, at times, left her lethargic and unable to use her quirk for long periods of time. To get around that unfortunate slight, her parents located and coincidentally invested in a brand of high-calorie snacks that were designed for people with quirks similar to hers. They'd provide all the necessary energy, without sacrificing taste, or including some dangerous ingredient that would leave her ill after consumption. Ashido glanced at the wrapper and hummed thoughtfully, prompting Yaoyorozu to swallow and speak. It's like a protein bar, common in the western side of the world. It's ideal for quirks that consume high levels of energy, she explained. What does it taste like? Ashido mused, sniffing the wrapper. She frowned, unable to place the scent. You can try one. I just don't know how much you'll like it. She paused, unable to find an appropriate description. Truthfully, they sat pretty heavily on her stomach, and just one bite made her feel like she was full. But she knew that the sensation was deceptive, especially since the whole bar was the recommended serving, and if she didn't scarf down the entire thing, she'd miss out on all the additional calories that her body would store as fats. For someone who couldn't readily burn the fat, she had no idea how it would present, but that didn't mean she would stop the pink girl. Besides, people ate them all the time for large-scale workouts, right? Yaoyorozu had, additionally, scanned over each ingredient and come to the conclusion that anyone could consume the bars. It ended up being a peace of mind study, since she didn't want to feel guilty if someone accidentally ate one of the bars and ended up feeling sick afterward. Both Kirishima and Kaminari put their hands up as Yaoyorozu offered them the box. Nah, I don't do well with calories, Kaminari muttered. I'll pass too. I just ate. Maybe another time, though. Yaoyorozu nodded, smiling as she turned the box to Hagakure and Tokoyami, who both refused the snacks. Ashido stuck her tongue out and blew them a raspberry. You guys are boring. I'll try one. She easily undid the wrapper and bit into the bar, before Yaoyorozu even had an opportunity to warn her about the fullness she felt after her first bite. She sighed. Mina would learn on her own. And sure enough, after 3 straight bites, and half the bar down her gullet, she paused and groaned uneasily. I feel like I ate a whole dinner. I did warn you they were dense, Yaoyorozu countered. Maybe dense hadn't been the best description? Ashido eyed the remaining bar and sighed. It did taste good though. She set the bar down, apparently not eager to choke down the remaining half. My poor tummy? A sudden noise from the entry of the kitchen drew everyone's gaze from Mina's spectacle toward the doorway of the kitchen, where Yaoyorozu blinked in surprise at their newest addition. A mess of bed-tossed green hair stood somewhat timidly in the doorway, the unmistakable glimmer of his emerald eyes shining as the kitchen's lighting struck them, though surprise was written all across his face. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to grab some water. I didn't know everyone was awake. Midoriya, bro. Being the first to recover, Kirishima's face easily slipped into a smile and he spread his arms, welcoming their newest companion. It's no biggie, we're all just kinda relaxing. We didn't wake you, correct? Yaoyorozu asked. While she was sure they hadn't been that loud, it was impossible to tell sometimes. Thankfully, he quickly refuted her question, shifting awkwardly in place as he did so. I just needed water. Izuu. Ashido cried, hands holding her stomach. My belly hurts, can you rub it? Even in the dark, it was impossible to miss the way Midoriya's face lit up like a Christmas tree, the heat practically radiating off his skin so that Yaoyorozu could feel it from where she was standing. I don't think. Please see. Ashido, don't pester him, Yaoyorozu lightly scolded. The pink-skinned girl paid her no heed though, and rushed over to the boy, practically sinking to her knees in an effort to convince him otherwise. I'll be your best friend. Hagakure took exception to that. Hey! It was plainly obvious she was wearing down his opposition. Finally, after a few more seconds of begging, he relented, and she pumped her fist in the air, celebrating as she did so. Yamamo, can we use the couch in the common room? She wanted to say no, and the better part of her told her to have everyone go back to bed. They had class in the morning after all. But yet, somehow, she felt like it wasn't the right thing to do. She knew Midoriya's history of nightmares. His current alert status whispered to her that he'd had another nightmare, and possibly wasn't ready to be ushered away from people that might be calming to him. Even something as trivial as rubbing Ashido's stomach might take his mind off of the nightmare, if that was what had drawn him from his slumber. So, she too relented. Okay, fine. But everyone needs to go to bed soon, deal? A few quiet celebrations rang out, and internally, Momo had a sneaking suspicion she'd just gotten played. But it was too late to revoke her decision, and she kind of wanted to relax on the couch anyway. She wasn't quite ready to go back to bed, and maybe quietly relaxing with her classmates would help lull the sensation of sleep back upon her. Within moments, they all migrated to the couch, after Midoriya got his cup of water as he'd initially come for, and as soon as he was seated, Mina tossed herself across his lap, drawing another round of blushing, and lifted her nightshirt, exposing her stomach, which really sent the poor teenager into a wave of stammering. Honestly, part of Yaoyorozu wondered if Ashido lived for this sort of thing. Come on. It's easy, just rub in circles. Mina encouraged, and despite his obvious reluctance, Midoriya began to rub her stomach, his posture stiff and his eyes anywhere but in front of him. Kirishima and Kaminari were honestly loving it, snickering and giggling like school children, while Hagakure cooed to herself. Tokoyami smirked, but was otherwise silent. You're a natural. Why are not helping? Midoriya mumbled. The small group fell into silence, minus Mina's faint mumbles of encouragement, countered by Midoriya's flustered mutters, and Yaoyorozu took another bite of her bar, slipping into a contemplative mood. She'd never exactly spent time with her classmates like this. Of course, they'd all study together, and once in a while, they'd have movie marathons, where everyone would be allowed to pick a movie, and they'd vote on which one to watch. Surprisingly, Mineta had won the vote several times, and so far, he'd had yet to disappoint with his selections. Otherwise, they ate together on certain occasions, and small outings were had between social groups, but otherwise, there wasn't a whole lot of separation in the social groups. Ida, Uraraka and Todoroki were most exclusively found at Midoriya's side, and although he didn't mind mingling with other groups, which likely was a result of his nightmare story he'd shared at her mansion previously, he mostly kept to his own group. Similarly, Kirishima and Kaminari kept to their exclusive and larger social group, which conveniently included Ashido and Hagakure. Tokoyami was usually found with Shoji and Koda, leaving just her as the outcast. She supposed she fit into Kirishima's group, but her distaste of Bakugo's rather vulgar diction pushed her toward Midoriya's group, especially since she'd found something of a kinship with Todoroki, dating back to their battle trial against Mr. Aizawa. But on a typical day, she didn't really have a socializing group, and for that, she felt a little excluded. Friends hadn't been something easy for her to come by, since her family was so well endowed. People regularly attempted to take advantage of her willingness to become friends, and because of that, she'd learned to become relatively careful with who she considered her actual friends. Her time at a private academy had also kept her from making specific friends, since many of her fellow classmates had come from around the country, not just the local area, making it hard to arrange for extracurricular activities. Yue had offered her the best chance so far, but strangely enough, she felt like she wasn't taking full advantage of it. Is there something on your mind, Yaoyorozu? Midoriya's voice snapped her from her thoughts, and she smiled kindly toward the boy's question, not ignoring how he seemed much more comfortable with his current actions. No, She trailed off. Was it right to speak her mind? It would only be burdening her fellow classmates with problems that weren't their own. Although, they were learning to be heroes, after all, and Midoriya specifically had portrayed an attitude that screamed, I don't care if it's not my problem, I care about everyone. Maybe they wouldn't mind? She sighed. Might as well be honest. Sometimes, I feel like I don't exactly resonate with everyone. She could feel everyone's looks on her as she focused her gaze onto her hands, which laid in her lap. I know that everyone is pleasant, but I wouldn't say I fit in with anyone specifically. If I must be honest, up until the tutoring, I don't know if I had fit in at all. Ah, you shouldn't think that way, Yayarozu, Kirishima piped up. I mean, I know it's not much, but you're pretty manly and dash. What he's trying to say, Hagakure interrupted sweetly, ignoring the red-haired teen's protests, is that you're really nice and you could talk to anyone if you wanted. But, I understand why it can be difficult. The invisible girl adjusted on the couch, sighing as she did so. Being, invisible, it can be kinda hard for me to break out. In middle school, I didn't stand out until my last year, because I didn't think anyone cared about an invisible girl. But then, one of my only friends told something important. Her voice turned softer, filled with emotion. We don't judge people on how they look anymore, because that's the norm, right? What's the difference between looking a certain way and not looking any way? And when I thought about that, it all kinda made sense. She looked over at Momo, not that anyone else could tell. So, I get what you mean. But, don't be afraid of pushing your comfort zones, otherwise you might never know where you fit in. Hagakure, Midoriya whispered. Ashido looked at where she was sitting with a new appreciation. She's right. Kirishima spoke up, his energetic voice oddly flat. I had a lot of problems with myself in middle school. Ashido seemed to stiffen under Midoriya's touch as the redhead spoke up, but she quickly settled, hoping no one noticed. He grimaced, running the tips of his fingers between the knuckles of his opposite hand, remembering what it was like before he arrived at UA with his new outlook. The time before he decided to be the manliest man that existed. For some reason, I couldn't really get confident. My quirk was weak. Boring, I guess. And then, I saw someone save my classmates when a villain showed up, and I began to think I'd never become a hero. I mean, how could I? My quirk was weak and I was weaker. I wasn't a hero, or a man. I was just a kid. I thought about giving up on my dream, but then, he clenched his fist. I saw an interview with Crimson Riot, and I thought to myself, isn't that the man you want to be? Isn't that the person you wanted to become? He looked up for the first time, a plain smile on his face. And I decided to make some changes to my life. No more would I doubt myself, or think of myself as incapable. No longer would I pass up an opportunity to help someone, because that's not what a real man would do. He looked at Yayarozu, and then at Hagakure, and his smile widened. I think the best part about UA is you get to choose who you want to be. You can decide if you want to be something else. Is it that easy? Kaminari wondered aloud. Everyone turned to look at him, and he suddenly realized he'd spoke aloud, waving his hands in defense. And not to say I think anyone is wrong. But, he turned downcast. You can't just change who you are overnight, can you? No, Mina said from her sprawled position over Midoriya's lap. But that doesn't mean it isn't a gradual process, either. I mean, look at me. She gestured to her whole body, from the mess of pink, curly hair atop her head, the tan horns that peeked through the untamable curls, to the bubblegum pink skin. Even her black scara, with the golden irises that were almost glowing in the nighttime light. I'm not normal. As a kid, it's not easy being so different. Even in the society they lived, children could be the most judgmental crowd, especially when quirks appeared. As time progressed, people became more accustomed to strange appearances, and more often than not, they were readily accepted by parents, friends, and classmates. However, that didn't mean that everyone was that accepting, and at points, small jabs could turn into periods of self-doubt. It's not an overnight transformation. I didn't just know I was beautiful, I had to come to accept it. Yaoyorozu almost sweat-dropped at the acid wielder's confident words, but a part of her respected the abundance of confidence she seemed to have. Part of her even envied Ashido, that was the same confidence she should have. People had been telling her since she was a child that she was beautiful, the proper mix of tall and slender, with accelerated developed as part of her quirk. Her eyes were radiant, her hair was silky, her skin was flawless, and she stood out in every appearance she made at her parents' parties. She'd been showered with compliments, yet they all felt hollow. And, as she stood amongst the adults, she didn't feel beautiful. She felt trapped. Nobody seemed to see her in a different light. It was all about her looks, accompanied by her amazing quirk. Nobody paid attention to her critics, or her demons. No one banished her doubts, or her questions. They left her to fight her own alienated mind, tending only to her outwardly appearance, as if their praise would land them in a favorable spot later in life. But she was not shallow, nor, she suspected, had she ever been. She wasn't particularly sure why that was. Her parents didn't exactly ingrain humility into her daily life, nor did they attempt to keep her grounded to earth. It was suspected that her inability to make friends was what kept her pride small, and her confidence smaller. Easy for you to say, you don't turn stupid when you overuse your quirk. Kaminari groaned, stray bolts of electricity dancing up his arm as he spoke. I can't tell you how many people in this class mock me because of that. I'm sure they're just joking, Midoriya protested. I mean, they make fun of me because I used to break everything. Kaminari was silent. Plus, you're really strong. I don't think there's anyone that could go toe-to-toe with you in pure power. Even Kaken. Your quirk is powerful, you're powerful. Kaminari snorted lightly. You're too pure, bud. A blush spread over Midoriya's cheeks, and he subconsciously began rubbing at Ashido's stomach faster. I don't know about that. You really are, dude. Kaminari leaned back, folding his arms behind his head as he thoughtfully looked toward the ceiling. Man, I wouldn't mind taking a crack at whoever bullied you in school. Midoriya froze, like he'd been encased by Todoroki's ice. Tokoyami frowned. I believe I might be missing something. Everyone looked uncomfortably at one another. The electricity user blanched, as if realizing his mistake, and he winced when he looked at the disapproving look on several of his friends' faces. Sorry. It's fine. Several eyes turned to Midoriya, who was moving once again. A small, almost faint, smile touched his lips. I've gotten over it. He paused, deliberating something before speaking again. I was bullied a lot in middle school. People said, and did, some terrible things. I kinda have nightmares now, and every so often, I remember the things they list. Is that why you're awake now? Tokoyami asked quietly. Silence. Why, had another nightmare. From the corner of her eye, Yaoyorozu saw Ashido squeeze Midoriya's thigh, which surprisingly didn't cause him to redden like everything else had. In fact, he almost seemed appreciative of her gesture, and offered her a wobbly smile in return as he picked up his rubbing once more. Was it? Kirishima trailed off, but the illusion remained intact. Was it like the last one? Midoriya hummed softly. Yeah. His voice was surprisingly rough, though it wasn't because of anger or irritation. Likely, it was due to his fatigue slipping into his words. Just the same one it always is. Nobody asked him if he was okay, because they already knew the answer to the question. He was still with them, so he'd assert as confidently as he could that he was fine. And they said, that? Kaminari asked, barely containing his anger. It still rubbed him the wrong way, it seemed. Midoriya nodded wordlessly. The yellow-haired teen huffed. Scumbags. You don't believe them, do you? Hagakure suddenly asked, fright slipping into her voice. Midoriya's eyes almost bulged from his head. No. I mean, when I was younger, maybe it crossed my mind, but it hasn't been something I've even wondered since meeting you all. I couldn't. He trailed off, sniffling. I couldn't do that to any of you. No one stirred, letting the silence blanket over them until Midoriya broke it again. Nothing can really erase their words, but everyone's kindness. It makes me glad I came here. A flurry of activities suddenly found Midoriya smothered in affection, as Ashido, Kaminari and Kirishima all dove to protect their precious cinnamon roll, with Hagakure jumping on top of the pile, giggling as she did so. Midoriya weakly protested, but began laughing as elbows poked into sides, drawing yelps and sharp protests from whoever got a rib full of elbow. Tokoyami teased a smile. I might not know your circumstances, but I applaud your resolve. You approached me during the sports festival, even when I had no one. My lonesome is something I've grown accustomed to, but I admit having your break that streak was very refreshing. Dark shadow makes it difficult to want to seek companionship because of how his power can change. Dark shadow crossing his arms as he silently floated in the air, behind the couch. My schooling has been spent mostly by myself, so for you to so readily break that, I appreciated that, Midoriya. Ah, looky. You've touched everyone here, you know? Ashido said, pinching Midoriya's cheeks. And you really touched me. I'm so proud of you. Ashido. Yaoyorozu smiled, repressing a laugh. She glanced at the clock and sighed as she realized the time. They were in for a nasty surprise when dawn broke. But as she glanced back at the dog pile that had formed, she realized it was the tender moments like these that mattered more than the extra 2 hours of sleep they'd probably not get anyways. The bonds they'd form, the experiences they'd share, the emotions they'd tie to one another each would serve them so much better. And so, they all stayed together, laughing and joking, and they groaned together when the sun peeked through the window, realizing they'd burnt the remainder of the night away. Yet, no one seemed to regret their choice. There was something that Class 1A had, that Class 1B was lacking. It was evident no matter who was looking, and despite all attempts to rectify and find that missing piece, it remained a solo divider between the two classes, much to the chagrin of many Class 1B students. They couldn't discover its origin, no matter how hard they looked. Many of them had settled on the difference being their experiences. Class 1A had, without a doubt, been exposed to far more in their young schooling career, and because of that, they supposedly stood above Class 1B. From the combat, to the teachings, to the attention they received, Class 1A was seemingly years ahead, and had no plans of stopping. Class 1B was the more studious class, scoring higher on practical exams, tests, and having a better class average. Yet, still, there remained a stark contrast. If you asked anyone in Class 1A, they'd tell you that it had nothing to do with murderous individuals revealing themselves and their intentions to the majority of the class, but instead, it had everything to do with who led their class. The strangest part was that it wasn't the class president and vice president that the students referred to, but rather a single individual who was more or less blind to his own involvement in the matter. He simply put his best foot forward, every day, and in doing so, had gained a following of students, willing to fight by his side, or fight for his justice, should it be necessary. Practically no one was foreign to his nightmares. Of course, he never made a big deal about them, because he didn't have to be a psychic to know that most of his friends were having their own nightmares. They'd all been exposed to the same horrors, they'd seen the same things. Some were able to cope better than others, but nobody judged anybody, especially when the kitchen lights would flicker, and someone could be heard rummaging through the fridge or turning the television on inside the common room because they were too wound up to go back to sleep. There was a group that had taken special care to watch out for Midoriya, not that he needed it, of course. He had no idea they were watching him either. The only reason they paid him the special care was because he'd earned it. Everyone had some trying times across their life. Well, for the most part. Everyone knew about Todoroki's home situation after he revealed his true happiness following his mother's discharge home from her hospital. And no one could forget Ida's brother, and the impact his paralysis had on Ida moving forward, despite his best attempts to remain strong. For each student, there was a story that followed them, not always a bright spot in their difficult, teenage lives. Midoriya's story wasn't a story he cared to share, because of the haunting fact that hid, immersed in the shadows, privy only to his knowledge. And every time he told his story, his heart clenched, remembering exactly who had spoken those poisonous words. But, even as he harbored that painful memory, it never crossed his mind to say anything about the specifics, not because they never asked who said it, but because he couldn't bear to ruin anyone's life over some words. Realistically, those words meant significantly more than any old words, and they were absolutely unacceptable for someone to say to their classmate, let alone anybody, but he also couldn't just bring up the past like that. Besides, Bakugo was different now, or so he told himself. And maybe, he thought to himself, it was wrong to keep that truth from his classmates. It wasn't exactly like they deserved to know who said it, but hiding something like that? Surely it would only lead to trouble, if they ever found out. They'd probably become furious. Of course, that was assuming they found out. Which, if they did, it wouldn't be because of his nightmares, that was for sure. There was also that small part of his mind that told him they'd leave him if they found out who had uttered those words. People had always chosen Bakugo over him. Why would this be any different? No matter what they said, their actions would be the real proof, and a small and very ashamed part of him, he believed they'd suddenly abandon him. So, it made even more sense to remain silent about the whole thing. That had been the plan anyways. He hadn't mean to say anything. But, ever since a young age, he'd had a terrible habit of muttering whenever he fell deep into thought, and without knowing it, that habit had extended to when he was asleep. It wasn't so much a muttering in his sleep, but instead, just a weak mumbling with the occasional mutter. He'd been told by his mother that it was rather adorable, but of course, he'd been mortified when he first found out. It hadn't occurred to him that anyone else would discover it, because he hadn't exactly anticipated ever falling asleep around anyone that wasn't his mother. You know, it's actually cute that Midoriya talks in his sleep, Ashido said casually. A few eyes slid her way, none surprised to see a tuft of green hair burrowed into her stomach, using her body as his pillow. Nobody knew when it developed, but lately he'd picked up a habit of falling asleep against the pink girl, and when he woke up, it would be the same routine, profusely apologize, despite her insistence of it being all right. As of now, he slumbered on, unabated. The class had just finished the first movie, and had been planning to watch a second one, but fatigue had begun to creep into their eyes once the climax came about, and now they were beginning to reconsider. Why am I not surprised? Kaminari teased lightly, prompting Ashido to stick her tongue out in retaliation. What is he saying? Hagakure leaned over, trying to catch an earful of the timid boy's words, but frowned as he went silent, a pout crossing her invisible features. Of course he won't talk now that I'm listening. Yaoyorozu sighed, but managed to suppress her giggle. I don't think that's quite how it works, Hagakure. A few students stood up and stretched out their sore and exhausted muscles, with more than a few pops and cracks echoing throughout the room. Shoji extended his arms, accepting the various emptied bowls from the students, receiving more than a few thank yous in response, responding with a mute nod. Everyone fell into their post-movie routine, round up any of their garbage, throw it away, get their blankets and pillows together, and decide whether to camp out in the common room or drag their feet toward their room and hope they made it before passing out. Ojiro glanced over at the clock. We've got some time. Does anyone want to play a game? A few heads perked up. Oh, I'd love to, Hagakure said excitedly. What games were you thinking of? Kirishima asked curiously. Strip poker, Mineta called, and a chorus of groans simultaneously rolled through the room. What? Didn't we ban you from suggestions? Jiro. Mineta crossed his arms and pouted. You all had no problem with the movie I picked? Ashido was sniggering, still snugly positioned on the couch, sneakily snapping a picture of herself and Midoriya, though the latter was blissfully unaware. She peeked up from her phone, rolling her eyes as she registered Mineta's suggestion. Geez, I'd rather take a nosedive off the roof than play strip poker with you. Ashido, please, Ida said firmly. Have a bit of care with your language. That's nothing to joke about. Before the pink girl could make any sort of response, the occupant on her abdomen suddenly began to thrash, his face scrunching up as his fists tightened, the familiar look of a nightmare tracing his expression. His quirk didn't activate, thankfully, as Mina realized how that might end for her, but he definitely wasn't calm, as his muttering began much faster than normal. Not the rooftop, not going up, not again, I won't. Ashido felt her heart begin to beat just a little faster. Rooftop? Was he dreaming about the person that told him to jump off the building? Had he accidentally heard her? A few of her nearby classmates noticed his suddenly erratic movements, and watched on worried, debating between waking the boy up or letting him sleep, with the hope that whatever it was he was thinking of would pass. Sife? Kaken? Ashido froze, and not just her, but several students halted in their tracks, their minds blank as Midoriya's faint words filled their brains. What had he meant by that? Several pairs of eyes darted from left to right, momentarily locking with another pair, before shifting over to catch someone else's reaction. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. A tense air settled around the room, suffocating and heavy, like a blanket made from steel. The sensation washed over everyone, and in the depths of their mind, thoughts began racing, various in nature, but negative in unison. What had he meant? "I idiot. Why would you say that?" Midoriya whispered. A stray tear leaked from his eye, despite how hard his lids were clamped shut, splashing harmlessly onto Ashido's shirt, dampening the fabric. On any normal given day, the pink girl would have gently stroked his hair, whispering sweet nothings in hopes of soothing his rave-ged soul, but this was not a given day, and this was nothing normal. They finally had an answer. "Casey Bakugo?" Kaminari hissed, only to be shushed by several of his classmates. Shakily, Mina ran her hand across Midoriya's cheek, hoping to pull him away from the nightmare he was stuck in. She looked at her classmates fearfully, but they were all paralyzed the same as she was. Part of her wanted to know more. There was always that little bit of doubt that existed. Maybe it wasn't Bakugo that had said it. Maybe he was just dreaming of a time when the blonde-haired kid was hitting him or chasing him. Maybe it was just him dreaming about a fight they were having. But maybe he was the one who said those vile words. "Wake up," Ashido murmured, hating how her request sounded like begging. Suddenly, the truth seemed toxic. She didn't want to know about it anymore. And like a spell, Midoriya's eyes fluttered open, and he yawned, gently sitting up as he rubbed at his eyes. He paused momentarily, noticing the water that dampened his fists, but resumed the rubbing, before slowly retracting his hands and catching the faces of everyone he shared class with. Midoriya? Gyro asked slowly. His eyes widened. Is everyone looking so scared? Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what to say. "What were you dreaming of?" Todoroki breathed, barely able to raise his voice. Midoriya hesitated, and the vice around everyone's heart grew tighter. "Nothing." Sensing everyone's disbelief, he began to squirm uncomfortably, the burning glare of the spotlight having metaphorically landed directly on top of him. Really? It was just a dumb dream? Dream or nightmare?" Tokoyami asked quietly. The green-haired boy looked away, his frown becoming more pronounced by the second. "It's just the same one I have all the time," Midoriya mumbled. Subconsciously, his hand flittered to his scarred hand and began rubbing at the marred skin, as if the rough patch was aching. "Bakugo," Kaminari repeated again, breathing his name. Midoriya froze. Everyone took a sharp breath in. What about him?" "You said his name." Ashido looked at him, her face unusually serious. There was a glimmer of fear that glistened in her amber eyes, and as she bit her lip, Midoriya realized why everyone looked like they'd seen a ghost. They had discovered who had been haunting his nightmares. They'd finally discovered his ghost. "No. It's Ina." He twisted, suddenly very aware of everyone's gaze, and their averting of said gaze. He looked at Uraraka, who was barely containing the tears that were pooling in her eyes. His neck snapped to look at Ida, who was frozen, like a statue, not speaking or moving. Panic began taking over as his eyes slid over to Azui. Even she was barely able to contain her emotions, she, one of the most composed students in the class. Nervous energy filled his muscles, and faintly, Midoriya registered the familiar tingling of full cowling spreading across his skin as his emotions began putting his body on autopilot. There was no one to fight, yet he felt like he had to protect himself. The hair on his neck stood on edge as he fell off the couch, staggering to his feet and backing away from the looks of his classmates, his friends. His breath hitched. "Stop. It's not Hitchy didn't." "Midoriya." Someone's voice barely registered in his brain. The walls were closing in. The ceiling, was it falling? Why did it seem so hard to breathe? "Izuku," Mina desperately called, noticing the signs of an anxiety attack taking over, the hyperventilation he was slipping into. She jumped off her place on the couch and immediately took his hands in hers, ignoring how clammy he felt, and tried rubbing circles on his palms, in an effort to draw him back to reality. "Listen to you. Everyone out, please." The stern voice of Yaoyorozu faintly registered in back of Midoriya's mind, but the sudden vacancy of the room seemed to open up the room a little bit, and slowly, he felt the cool, refreshing air begin filling his lungs once more, and the throbbing in his chest began to settle. Tears prickled at his eyes. "We're not going anywhere," Mina whispered comfortingly. Her gaze flickered to Uraraka, Ida, Azui, Todoroki, and Kirishima, nodding slowly to them in an effort to get them to come over. "It'll be okay. Just keep breathing." But it wouldn't be okay. Midoriya knew better. What the fuck did we just witness? Kaminari was the first to break the silence that had fallen over the class as they stepped outside, the only place Yaoyorozu could think of that would handle the dozen or so of them. He'd been the first to snap from his stupor, and while the shock had begun to fade, the rage that took its place was no better. "A deeply held secret?" Aoyama said softly. Silence took over once more, nobody having anything to say, nobody knowing what to say. "This is all sorts of screwed up," Mineta mumbled, leaning against the wall of the building, sliding down into a sitting position. Honestly, that was not what he'd expected when he'd voted for a movie night. Hell, he hadn't even known that Midoriya and Bakugo had such a history. They didn't really like each other. Well, Bakugo didn't like Midoriya, but that was something that Mineta just couldn't comprehend. Midoriya was cool. He was selfless. Even though he was timid, he didn't yell or scream, and from what Mineta could tell, he didn't even judge anyone. It wasn't quite unanimous, but most people believed that Izuku was among the top in the class, if not being the top. Mineta, personally, believed wholeheartedly that Midoriya belonged at the top, just for the stuff he'd seen the strength enhancement teenager do. Hadn't been for Midoriya's quick mind, Mineta wasn't sure if he'd still be around. Period. Because of that, the short teen had nothing but respect for his friend, and he'd proudly call Midoriya a friend until the day he died. Even if he couldn't always understand the timid boy's vision, or his unstoppable drive, Mineta would always respect and look up to Midoriya. But this was all so unexpected. "It appears there's more to their story than simple rivals," Shoji muttered, folding all but two of his arms over his chest. "I'm not quite sure what to think about this." Yaoyorozu shot him a weak glare. "We shouldn't rush into assumptions with this. And we definitely shouldn't treat anyone differently until we know more. You can't honestly tell me that this," Kaminari said heatedly, gesturing to everything around them, "is up for debate." Bakugo told Midoriya to key dash. Unable to take any more, Gyre jammed her ear jack into the yellow-haired boy's side, eliciting a sharp hiss from him, but more importantly, stopping his tirade before it went out of control. She weakly glared at him, which he returned, though it wasn't because of her intervention, and they both knew that. Everyone was worked up, and tempers were high. Nobody knew what to do. The tall, black-haired girl drew a breath in, pinched the bridge of her nose, and exhaled. "Is there anyone unfamiliar with what is going on? I might as well eliminate any doubts, so that we prevent rumors from popping up." A few shaky hands went up, and Yaoyorozu nodded slowly. She wasn't exactly surprised. Most of the class hadn't yet discovered the history that Midoriya had shelved away, far out of reach for anyone, including himself. Part of her felt dirty as she contemplated how to reveal the skeletons that lurked within their classmates' closet. It wasn't her secret to share, after all. But if she didn't say anything, a curse tumbled from her mouth before she could stop herself. If she remained mute, then there was a very realistic chance that the rumors would crop up like small fires, before they run rampant and catch the whole school ablaze. Then, Midoriya would be forced into a situation that he certainly wanted to avoid. "It should be clear," Yaoyorozu said slowly and deliberately. "Anything said here, tonight, remains here. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is to find out about this. If anyone decides to share what they learn..." The tall girl trailed off, her eyes stony and her gaze cold. She was above meager threats, the vague promises demeaning to her status. However, she would ensure that anyone that couldn't contain themselves would be properly dealt with. There seemed to be a consensus, everyone hastily agreeing with Yaoyorozu's heavy words, most likely to avoid her rage. It slightly bothered her, and she hoped that they were agreeing simply because they wanted to help their frightened classmate, but ultimately, their reason wasn't within her control. The only thing that mattered was their loyalty. Right? As you have seen, Midoriya and Bakugo do share a history together. She still wasn't certain of how to begin the tale, but clearing the obvious seemed like an ideal start. History, like dating? Yaoyorozu pinched the bridge of her nose. She shot a weak glare at Mineta, but her glare wavered as she failed to note any malicious or snark on the short boy's expression. In fact, he looked simply scared. She sighed but clarified. No, they were classmates. Childhood. Friends. Nobody could miss the inflection in her tone as she uttered friends. From everything I've gathered, Bakugo developed his quirk and became rather inflated. Midoriya was a late bloomer. And by that, I mean late. I don't mean to interrupt, Siro said, quivering slightly as Yaoyorozu's steely gaze settled on him. But I think we all kinda know that, right? I mean, Bakugo's a cocky ass, and Midoriya's kinda scared all the time, but what does their quirk development have to do with anything? Yaoyorozu bit her lip. Here came the first trial. Bakugo bullied Midoriya. Harshly. The reactions were exactly as Yaoyorozu expected. There was anger. Kaminari hissed again, his temper still running hot from earlier. Tokoyami's usual unflappable visage became darker, and his eyes seemed to radiate power as he glowered silently. Aoyama seemed to glare, although with his usual expression, it was difficult to discern his true feelings, minus his quiet mumbles. How uncouth. Jiru seemed relatively uncomfortable, rubbing her arm as she kept a vigilant eye on Kaminari, her earjacks at the ready. Shoji simply seemed stunned, his eyes wide and his arms limp. Koda didn't hesitate to shed a tear, and he pitifully gazed back toward the door they'd emerged from. Oh sure? Ojiro asked shakily, drawing everyone's attention to him. He seemed to be struggling between accepting and denying the information, not like Yaoyorozu could blame him. She'd been rather surprised when she found out initially, despite her hypothesis. Bakugo is an ass, but that's kind of far, especially for someone who wants to be a hero. Have you seen him? Kaminari erupted, his quirk flaring up coincidentally. Really, the kid has been a jerk to everyone since arriving at this school. He regularly talks down on people and calls us all extras because he thinks he's the best at everything. I wouldn't be shocked if he was the one who told Midoriya to die. Die! Several students blurted out, and in a matter of several seconds, the order that Yaoyorozu had established came crashing down. Chaos reigned supreme, voices clamoring above one another in a vain effort to be heard. Yaoyorozu didn't have the heart to glare at the electrification user. Honestly, she felt and supported his rage. When Midoriya had initially revealed the relationship he and Bakugo shared, the tall girl had her own suspicions. His meek behavior around the blonde, paired with everything he embodied upon his initial acceptance into UA, led her to believe that he was a likely culprit. She, of course, hadn't said anything, because rumors were unbecoming of her, as well as any prospective hero. That didn't stop her from speculating, however. And, as she studied their dynamic in class, and in the halls, she couldn't ignore the glare that Bakugo would level on Midoriya's unaware figure. It was almost as if the explosive boy had a personal grudge, something fueled by years and years of building. As much as it frustrated her, she couldn't determine why that was. Midoriya was a fairly innocent person, a bit overzealous about being a hero, but nothing that she didn't respect and wish to embody as well. A small part of her wondered if perhaps Midoriya had been different in middle school, but his personality said otherwise. It was too radical for him to change so suddenly in one summer. And the honesty behind his words during their little moonlight therapy session had her convinced he'd been a rather timid child too. Which begged the question, why did Bakugo treat Midoriya as a personal attack to his life? There was the obvious aspect of Midoriya's rapid development. If he'd been formerly quirkless as he suggested, then perhaps Bakugo felt threatened by his classmates' sudden ascension and utilization of his powerful quirk. But that was petty behavior. It was the telling signs of a mental disorder, one that needed psychological intervention, lest it develop into something further, and judging by the toxic relationship between Midoriya and Bakugo, it was clear that it had been left untouched for years. Truthfully, Momo could not imagine their fragile status becoming any further tainted. Without the ability to ask Bakugo himself, Yaoyorozu had to admit her frustration and accept that she would never truly know the answer to the questions that plagued their dynamic. As much as it bothered her and concerned her, she would be stuck in an endless loop, with no satisfying answer to quench her parched need for knowledge. It was only because of Jairu that the clamoring between classmates came to an abrupt end, the earjack heroine's quirk quickly drowning out the frantic questions that ricocheted around, bouncing off other statements, gaining both momentum and impact. With no answers, most of Class 1A was left desperately trying to piece together a puzzle, not knowing if they even had the right pieces. Everyone shut it. Jairu's strained voice followed her quirk, and despite the lack of volume to it, there was immediate silence as everyone focused their attention on the girl, worry etched onto everyone's face. "Oh, just let Yamamoto explain." She turned to Yaoyorozu, who flashed her an appreciative smile, and shakily nodded. "I hope you have answers." The tall girl exhaled. Unfortunately, not all of them. That much was true, she didn't know all of the answers. There were many gaps, voids that sucked in darkness, leaving a whistling hole of nothingness where something should be. The waters were murky, scoured with confusion, conflicting theories and hypothetical conceptions, but there was still some truth within the depths. Bakugo might have not be approachable, and Midoriya might have endlessly defended his former bully, but Yaoyorozu Momo was not a quitter, and with the time she'd taken, there were some answers that she had managed to pry from his past. But let's start from what I know. Gee guys, I can't. Wet, snotty hiccups punctuated each word, breaking apart the already fractured sentence, and making Midoriya's feeble protests harder to interpret and more concerning to hear. The departure of his classmates had given Midoriya the space he needed to breathe and think, but it had also removed the power of persuasion from his hand, leaving him without another plan. He'd simply clung to Ashido and Uraraka, trying desperately to listen to their soothing voices and calm down, yet finding each breath he took challenging. He couldn't believe he'd upped and revealed everything in a matter of minutes. He only had 2 secrets to keep, and one wasn't even his to know. There was no need to bring up the past or involve anyone in his past endeavors and struggles. No reason at all. Yet, here he was having a breakdown on the floor of the common room, while everyone suddenly learnt about his history of abuse. Abuse. It sickened him to think that his entire middle school experience had been mired by abusive peers. He didn't want to believe it if he were honest. Part of him wondered if he'd done something to deserve that behavior, then maybe it would have been justified response from his classmates. But with as long as he looked, he could never find anything that deserved the kind of treatment he received. The cherry on top? Bakugo's involvement. It was fucked up to think that his childhood friend was the one leading the charge, no matter how he looked at it. He tried convincing himself that Bakugo wasn't the same kid he was back then, and for the most part, he was correct. The sandy-haired teenager had displayed numerous instances of growth, starting simply with the sludge villain and expanding to instances such as the sports festival speech. Bakugo's vague and poorly masked compliments toward people like Uraraka and Kirishima were examples of his expanding vision and bolstered the idea in Midoriya's mind that Bakugo was growing. It was slow but encouraging growth. Then he'd gone and unraveled everything. All because he couldn't keep his dumb, stupid mouth shut. "Easy there," Ashido murmured softly, stroking his back gently with the tips of her fingers. Uraraka followed suit, but grasped his scarred hand firmly, rubbing the pad on her thumb across his knuckles, eliciting a strange sensation on the surface of his skin. He likely would have pondered it more had he felt all right, but he didn't feel all right, and that was the problem. He hiccuped again. "I messed everything up." "Nonsense." Ida's typically booming voice was much more reserved, and far gentler than Midoriya could ever recall. "You haven't messed anything up, Midoriya. We just would like to be there for you if you want us to be." There was a lot that went unspoken as Ida trailed off, and for one moment, Midoriya hesitated. Was this how Ida felt when his brother had been attacked by Stain? The moment of unclarity, where everything felt wrong and it seemed like there was no right. Was this what Ida felt before he decided that the only course of action was revenge? Revenge, in this case, was unnecessary, and by extension, there was nothing to avenge. But the hopeless feeling was crippling, and all Midoriya wanted was for it to go away. If being honest would rid that suffocating sensation, then he'd be honest. Okay. All right. He nodded slowly, his sniffling slowing down as he blinked a few times, clearing the tears from his sight. He trailed off. He wasn't sure what to say. You dreamt of Bakugo, didn't you? Todoroki asked quietly. Midoriya timidly nodded. Why? That was the question, wasn't it? Midoriya would have snorted, maybe even laughed bitterly, had he been a little more frustrated. But, alas, he wasn't going totally crazy, it just felt tired. Tired of the nightmares. Tired of the reminders. Tired of Bakugo. Not of his actual person, but of the way he used to be. It was difficult to explain, and he knew that anything he said wouldn't particularly make sense out loud, but honestly, he wasn't even sure if he understood his thought process. Even so, he had to try. At the very least, he had to articulate his thoughts in the best way possible, even if nobody understood him. But first, he had to be honest. He steeled his resolve. He had to be strong. Strong, like All Might. He couldn't cower out. He had to be honest. His friends, they deserved his honesty. When Kaken and we went to middle school together. And he bullied me. Because your quirk hadn't manifested, Ashido supplied helpfully, smiling as Midoriya gave her a look of appreciation. Ida and Ashido know the story, most of it, anyways. Kirishima. But Todoroki, Uraraka and Azui, they don't know anything. Midoriya bit his lip in thought. I can't just dive in, but I can't dodge around either. I just have to phrase everything that's so nobody goes wild. Ashido might actually try and fight Kaken, even if Ida and Kirishima hold her back. Uraraka and Azui, they're harder to gauge. But, he gulped. They won't leave me. Trust them. He nodded subtly. Yes, he trusted them. They'd stay with him. They'd proven that from the moment when everyone had sat with him during his initial story. They wouldn't abandon him, they wouldn't. During a confrontation, someone told me to go the rooftop and jump off, if I wanted a quirk. Saying it aloud was still painful. He felt the tremble in his voice as he recalled the exact words, closing his eyes as he tried to push the various emotions away. He couldn't break down yet, he had to remain strong. With a heavy exhale, pushed on, silently gauging everyone's expression. Ashido and Kirishima had familiar flickers of anger flush across their faces, and Ida seemed stone-faced, but not enraged. Uraraka and Azui was horror-stricken, but most interestingly had to be Todoroki, who was neutral-faced, silently withholding his reservations until the end. That scared Midoriya, if he were honest. Someone predictable was anxiety-inducing, but at least he had an idea of what they would do. Those that didn't give any indication of their thoughts, they were the real scary ones. One moment they were passive, and the next was a mystery. Deciding to keep an eye on Todoroki, Midoriya continued. I guess you probably have put everything together by now. Kaken was the one who said that. Uraraka whispered, covering her mouth. Why would he say that? 'Cause he's a fucking asshole, that's why, Ashido seethed. Her amber eyes seemed darker, and her glare didn't help the look. It didn't take much effort to noticing her barely contained rage, and for a split second, Midoriya was actually afraid she was going to seek out Bakugo and go a few rounds with him. They had once been something akin to friends. Anyone could see that Ashido once respected his battle prowess and insane skill. In the same regards, he could see why she became cold to his name. Just like Kaminari, just like Yaoyorozu, just like the entirety of Class 1, they were heroes. Heroes that opposed bullies. Instead of going to start a fight, she surprised him. She exhaled thickly, shooting one last venomous glare toward the staircase that led to Bakugo's dorm, before wrapping her arms around Midoriya's torso and pulling him into her embrace. With their awkward position, her chest pressed against his back, causing him to blush as he felt her womanly parts press against the muscle of his back. But he didn't squirm out of her grip. Later on, we're going to have a talk with him, Ashido said firmly, and although Midoriya couldn't tell, he knew she was giving everyone a fierce look that probably said, "Come with me or I'll do it alone." Before he could dissuade her or convince her otherwise, she gave him a firm squeeze and rested her head against his neck. "But right now, we need to make sure you're okay." Democrat Delaware. Midoriya? Izuku blinked. Uraraka had never not called him Deku. He felt a tightness in his chest as his anxiety began building up. Was she mad? Did she not believe him? Did she secretly love Bakugo, and now that he'd been open, was she going to fight him? I'm sorry. He froze. I never realized that all the times he yelled at you, he was saying worse. I didn't know that the nickname he gave you. I didn't. She sniffled, and Midoriya became acutely aware of just how distraught she was. A pang of guilt hummed through his chest as he desperately tried to think of something to say. Please, don't change my name. He shivered, though it was difficult to tell if it was because he was emotional, or if he was perhaps a bit cold. His feeble trembling only caused Ashido to grip him tighter, while Tsuyu leaned into the green-haired boy's side, closing her eyes, a soft "Jero," the only noise she made. Why you change that name, you know? If why you don't use it, then how can I be the Deku that saves everyone? It wasn't exactly what he meant to say, but then again, he hadn't had anything finite in the swirling maelstrom of emotion that was raging within his head. Rather, it was what he needed to say, a truth that had been pushed out by the heart instead of the brain. Deep down, Deku had become more than simply a nickname that had been changed. It had become an identity, a part of the hero that Midoriya strived to become. He wanted to remember those feelings of inadequacy and channel them into productive moments, where even the quirkless kid watching would be inspired. He wanted to prove to everyone that the starting line wasn't the ending line. He wanted to be an inspiration for anyone to become a hero. He wanted to be his own hero. Through his trembling, Ashido held on to him firmly, vaguely concerned of the teen's mental state. Tsuyu had curled up at his side, hoping that the comfort of people would help his vicious anxiety ebb away into a management state. I am Deku. If you take that away. He hiccuped. Then who am I? It was perhaps the first time that anyone had ever heard Midoriya say his hero name. They'd seen him write it. They'd heard others refer to him by the moniker. They'd bore witness to the transformation of his once belittling title, and were inspired by his iron-firm belief that it was a name that he could use as a means for inspiration. But up until now, nobody had ever heard him actually say his name. It wasn't particularly as if anyone believed he had any doubts about selecting the title, because the steely courage in his eyes told them otherwise. He truly wanted to be known as Deku. But even through his belief, there was concern that perhaps he, himself, wasn't ready to utter the syllables, because it was a matter of conviction. Nobody would have known that Midoriya spoke his name firmly to Gran Torino, and nobody was the wiser, but within Midoriya felt a bubble of tranquility. The sensation was akin to a warmth, much like Ashido's hugs or Uraraka's smiles. It was similar to the feeling of Todoroki's subtle nods and faint smiles, or Ida's appreciative gestures. It was synonymous with Kirishima's hearty pats to his back, or Tsuyu's gentle nuzzling whenever she was close. You're the Deku who can do it, Uraraka wailed, clasping her arms around his neck and pulling herself into his chest. Her sniffling was loud, but the pounding in Midoriya's head was louder as his heart seemed to restart, and a rush of emotions surged through his body. It was strange, he'd later think. The sudden flow of emotion was almost intoxicating, captivating him a warm glow, before he noticed a foreign sensation starting in his heart and spreading diffusely. While it wasn't quite a heat, there was definitely a trace of warmth in the feeling, though it felt light. He blinked, having felt the feeling a few times before. Acceptance. Suddenly, the ice-cold fear that Midoriya felt strangling him began releasing, as the warmth spread evenly through his fingers and toes, throughout his core and chest. It wasn't the same physical warmth as One for All or Contact, but it shared a unique trait with all of those sensations. He felt at peace. Bakugo's looming punishment and alienation remained on the forefront of his mind, and that in itself brought its own rush of anxiety. But the fear of the unknown, the fear of not being accepted, faded, and was replaced by a sense of camaraderie. There was no chance that anyone was going to abandon him, because in truth he had never been alone. Not since the first day of entering UA. Uraraka had remained firmly by his side, even as he stuttered and sputtered, unable to contain his fear or his massively overpowered quirk. Ida had remained firmly by his side, despite the difference in the personality and the waging war that the young class president had waged on a bloodthirsty criminal. Todoroki remained firmly by his side, despite the insults and disrespect he'd slung at the dual-quirk teenager, challenging everything the boy had ever thought. Kirishima had remained firmly by his side, despite the friendship and respect he'd established with Bakugo and learning the truth behind his tormentor. Tsuyu had remained firmly by his side, facing down the eerie darkness that loomed within the League of Villains' initial appearance. And Ashido hadn't left his side, not since learning the truth. She had always been there, greeting him, talking to him, including him. She was quietly fighting the battle that he'd always hidden away, and somehow he'd been none the wiser. He teared up. He had the greatest of friends. Bakugo Katsuki didn't lose. But in the moment, he was beginning to question what kind of battle he was getting ready to fight. The following 3 days of class were awkward, to say the least. What began as an uncomfortable silence between the majority of Class 1A and their resident hot-headed explosive expert Bakugo Katsuki quickly turned into a war zone. There were glares exchanged, scowls compared, and even a few scathing words fired back and forth between some of the more vocal students of Class 1A, but nothing drastic occurred until the 4th day. That was the day that the fireworks began, and the aforementioned war zone became a literal battlefield. It was difficult to pinpoint the exact incident that set Bakugo off. It could have really been anything. He was hardly ignorant to the sudden animosity he was receiving at the hands of his fellow classmates, though if he were honest, he could care less. While he would admit it was nice having training partners that weren't complete pushovers, he could also admit that he didn't really care if anyone was pissed with him or not. In his mind, their problem was their problem, not his. That was what he'd thought, until, suddenly, he found it significantly more difficult to get things done during class. He found himself suddenly studying alone, which he was initially content with, until he began finding himself in a rut with the lessons, and no one to compare notes to. When it came time for partner activities, there was a sudden lull in activity, where nobody moved, hoping that they weren't going to be placed at his side. Then when he finally received his partner, they'd either be silent or ice-cold to him, giving him a look that rivaled even Todoroki's stoic glare. Again, though, he didn't care. He wouldn't care. Their problem was, once again, theirs. As long as it didn't affect his work, then the grass-munching fuckers of Class 1A could do whatever they saw fit. That all changed when Hero Studies came around, and he was placed in a group of 4 with Todoroki, Shoji, and Mineta. Their names didn't really matter to him, nobody's really did. Hell, he didn't really care about his own name. He just cared about who knew it and how they knew it. He refused to be known as someone who was a lost cause, someone like Deku. Midget and Octopus, you two go right. Half and half, follow them from a distance. From a kneeling position, Bakugo grunted as he adjusted the large canister grenade on his arm. The task, in his opinion, was simple. Located within the mock city, be the first to the objective, set up a defense, and hold it. He could care less what task it simulated, all he had to do was fight off everyone and win. Even still, he had a plan. Funnel them to his teammates, and when they became overwhelmed with the numbers, he'd crush them. I'll hunt down the fuckers that trail off before they even know what hit them. There was no doubt that he was looking forward to the chance to vent his mounting frustration. Even now, his team was glaring at him, even the fucking purple grape. The little fucker that nobody seemed to like and dressed like he was wearing a fucking diaper. And yet, nobody seemed to care, because they were all too busy glaring at him like he'd stepped on a puppy or some shit. With a growl, he prepped himself to launch, but stopped short when he heard a defiant response that he hadn't been expecting. No. Whirling, he caught the eye of Mineta, and for a moment he was wide-eyed and shocked. Had the fucking midget, the same one that did nothing but perv on women, annoy the rest of the class, and had an incessant habit of running away from combat, just outright defied him? There was a moment of silence. Nobody seemed to move. The words rung in Bakugo's ears over and over, and for a tense moment he couldn't figure out if he was hearing things. Surely nobody would actually defy him, let alone a pebble that was smaller than even Deku? The damn nerd had grown a backbone since his mysterious quirk appeared, but he'd only actually offered any form of defiance once. The rest of it was a meager struggle that would be handled with vigorous aggression. But this kid? This fucking loser? It was ominous how slowly Bakugo walked toward Mineta. The boiling anger that had been stewing for several days had finally reached its spilling point, and it was leaking from the explosive boy's pores, threatening to douse everything around. A forced smile spread painfully slow across Katsuki's face. Care to say that again, asshole? The purple-headed fuck was trembling. Even though he'd somehow found the stones to speak up when he had no reason to say anything, he was still quaking with the mere prospect of being approached. If he hadn't been so enraged, Bakugo might have scoffed at the remark, chalking it up to a fool's moment of idiotic bravery. But he was pissed. And this was too much to ignore or scoff at. Bakugo came to a rest a few feet away, glaring hatefully down at the small boy, expecting a fearful apology at any moment. His fists clenched and unclenched underneath of his padded gloves, stretching the muscles in his hands out with each extension, a habit of his whenever his anger took the driver's seat. Well, I said no. All of his anger faded for a split second. This kid was serious, wasn't he? I'm not listening to a big bully, Mineta proclaimed through the waver in his voice. His gaze radically shifted from Todoroki to Shoji, and Bakugo realized that he was betting on his two teammates to protect him should things get dicey. And judging by the frost that wafted from Todoroki's hand, a fight would definitely break out if Mineta were to pay for his words. But Bakugo's rage knew no limits. Who gave a shit about the exercise anymore? Clearly his team didn't, because it was no secret that there was a clear difference between the top of the class and the bottom. Half and Half was, begrudgingly, a member of the top of the class, but he was barely near the top. No, the honor of being the best belonged to Bakugo himself, and he knew it. But it wasn't indisputable, and that's what made it tricky, and also made it annoying. Being the best meant nothing if it wasn't indisputable, ergo, there was still plenty of work he'd have to do to reach that level. But that wasn't his focus now, his entire being screamed for him to smite the grape that dared speak against him. Bakugo muttered, narrowing his eyes hatefully on the purple boy, causing said boy to yelp and grab his head defensively. He forced his voice to be calm, he'd explode on them in a couple of seconds. The fuck you think you're saying, huh? Mineta bit his lip, eyeing Bakugo disdainfully. There was emotion within his eyes, emotion that the sandy-haired blonde had never seen within his eyes before. From the first moment of class, when Bakugo had eyed everyone down, judging who would potentially challenge him and who would be a useless extra, he'd never seen even a remote iota of challenge from the purple-haired runt. But now, it seemed, there was something there after all. And that pissed him off even more. I won't listen to anyone that's a bully, Mineta repeated. There that word was again. Bully. It sounded so bitter, coming off the tongue of the diminutive perspective hero. Like it carried experience with it. Like it carried knowledge. Ordinarily, I never expected to agree with Mineta. Bakugo's eye shifted over to Todoroki, who met his glare with a frosty glare of his own. Both parties ignored the feeble tay from Mineta as they gauged each other's next move. There was a stalemate in place, neither party looking for the first move. They both understood the truth. They were very close in terms of power. The first move could be their own undoing. Todoroki slowly adjusted, rotating his body so that his hot side was turned toward Bakugo, a sign that irritated, yet excited the blonde. The last time they'd fought, Bakugo could still recall his seething rage at the half-and-half teenager refusing to utilize his full power, despite having used it the match prior. I think we can agree, however, that he has a point. Bakugo huffed angrily. The fuck's that mean? If it were possible, Todoroki's glare became colder, and Bakugo could almost feel the creeping chill of the boy's dual quirk. You know exactly what I mean. The things you did to Midoriya were unspeakable. That damn debt. He always ruined everything. Every single time. What did that shitty nerd say now? Bakugo raged, all memory of the training event gone from his mind. This time, Shoji spoke up, his voice breaking the standoff between the two top students. It's what he didn't say that has everyone in an uproar. He tried to hide everything, you know? Protect you. I don't know why. It was inevitable looking back. Any time that Deku came up, Bakugo knew he had the tendency to blow his lid. It wasn't even close, either. His mother had warned him, not that he'd ever cared to listen, that one day he'd come across someone that wouldn't give him the opportunity to throw his temper tantrums. He disagreed vehemently, stating they weren't tantrums, not that his mother listened, of course. In his mind, her warning was stupid. He had always been the top dog, the best of the best. His quirk was amazingly powerful, and everyone else's wasn't. But then he'd started at UA. He'd seen evidence that everything he knew wasn't entirely true. Todoroki had demolished the first heroic exercise with apt precision that actually woke Bakugo up for the first time ever. Suddenly, he was keenly aware that he wasn't clearly the best anymore. Then, Deku came and further challenged that change by actually beating him in a combat test. That day, he took a silent vow, don't lose again. The best don't lose. It only added to the previous ideals he held. The best don't need saving. The best don't need help. The best are the strongest. And Deku was always there, messing up everything. It was like the green-haired idiot didn't understand the rules of being a hero. Always butting his head in, always getting in the way, violating the rules. He hated it. He always did. Shut up. A teeth-rattling explosion punctuated his words, sending out rippling shockwaves as he detonated the ground below him with rage-fueled attack, aimed at nothing. He felt the fibers in his arms strain under the force of the attack, but his rage-clouded brain paid the minimal pain little heed as he seethed, breathing in heavily through teeth clenched so hard they might fracture under the pressure. Dust was blown everywhere, mixing with the inky smoke from the explosion, resulting in a thick veil that obscured everything from sight. I didn't ask for that fucking nerd's help. I don't want his fucking protection. A wall of ice breached the smoke, casting the air aside as the glacier rushed forward with deadly intention, enveloping its path in a thick layer of frost. When Bakugo caught sight of it hurtling toward him, he raised his arms and willing an explosion forth, interrupting the ice with another ground-rumbling bang. More smoke was tossed up, but with the freezing slab of ice cutting through the air, everything was significantly more visible, including Todoroki's darkened glare. You don't deserve it either, Todoroki muttered, prior to sending a wall of flames forward. The heat was a drastic change from the cold, but in it, Bakugo felt his body suddenly beginning to produce ounces more sweat. He dove forward, narrowly missing the flames, and blew himself up into the air, before redirecting himself with another explosion, throwing his body toward Todoroki like a missile. The blonde reared his leg back, prepared to deliver a devastating kick, but when he tried to pivot his body, he realized that his arm was stuck to his side by a purple ball. Ordinarily, that might not have been effective, but with Bakugo's sudden inability to shift mid-air, the explosion user found himself unable to deliver the attack as intended, resulting in an awkward angle with the arc of his swing. Todoroki ducked under the attack and retaliated with a pillar of ice, capturing Bakugo within momentarily. "Fuck this!" he roared, shattering the ice with a tremendous boom. Just as he tried to rip his arm free from the sticky orb stuck to his side, he was tackled by the monstrous Shoji, the multi-limbed student, taking the open opportunity to swing him around and throw him aside. Bakugo skid across the ground, but successfully regained his footing as he rolled, heaving as he did so. 3 opponents, he growled to himself. It wasn't going to be easy to win. He hated to admit it, but half and half was a decent challenge alone. The tentacle freak was physically strong and very durable. The purple fuck was an inconvenience at best, but could be almost dangerous if left untouched. There was always backing down. But the red in his vision didn't bother looking for an escape. So, he took a step forward, ready to pounce, before Aizawa's stern voice echoed throughout the intercom system located within the mock city. "That will end this exercise. If anyone attacks again, I can promise expulsion, no questions asked." Nobody dared move. "I guess that's all, huh?" Todoroki said icily. There was practically venom dripping from each word he spoke. Bakugo spit on the ground, micro-explosions popping off in his palms. "Not by a long shot, fucker. I won't forget this." He looked at Shote, who simply stared back, unflinching, and then turned his gaze onto Mineta. The kid cowered away, his defiant from melting in the face of unbridled rage. "And I don't fucking forgive either. Don't expect us to either," the half-and-half teen muttered, standing straight up. Bakugo Katsuki didn't lose. But in the moment, he was beginning to question what kind of battle he was fighting. Would anyone care to explain why they felt it necessary to attack their own teammates? It wasn't an understatement to say that Aizawa was furious. Just the look on his face promised a year-long detention with daily, hellish chores, reserved for whatever imbecile admitted fault for the fight, which Bakugo had no intention of doing. He hadn't started shit. He wasn't taking a single ounce of blame either. There was no time between being summoned off the training ground and arriving within Mr. Aizawa's line of sight. The rest of the class was presumably under another teacher's supervision, or possibly even left to their own devices. It was impossible to tell which. Not that it mattered, Aizawa was outright pissed. There was an uneasy silence between the other three, however, as they glanced at one another. "I will not ask again, do I make myself clear?" There was a resounding "sir," followed by a brief moment of silence. Then, Todoroki cleared his throat. "There have been some recent developments?" Aizawa raised an eyebrow, but was otherwise silent. There was no need for him to say anything, because his message was clear. Why did they matter so much? Todoroki seemingly squirmed in place, an action that reminded Bakugo stunningly of Deku and the boy's former inability to talk in front of people when summoned to do so. "They're personal," he finished lamely. Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose, releasing a heavy sigh. This had better be something. He released his grip and looked at Todoroki, an expression of utter fatigue plastered across his face. "We can discuss these personal matters in private. You three will remain here. If a single word is said while I'm gone, I can promise you'll wish you had the disciple to stay quiet." With that stern promise, Aizawa took a slightly hesitant Todoroki into a nearby room, sealing the duo away from earshot. All the while, Bakugo glared angrily at the ground. His hands, now free from the large, grenade-shaped gauntlets he typically wore, were shoved angrily crossed over his chest since his hero costume came without pockets. He stared straight down, refusing to meet the surely glaring gaze of Shoji or the mildly terrified look of Mineta. Something about their looks pissed him off more than usual. He thought back, trying to properly recall the whole reason the fight had broke out in the first place. Deku, of course, had been the main cause. But that hadn't been it, had it? This was more than just some simple, shitty Deku-caused thing. Somehow, they were all siding with Deku over something. It didn't make sense for him to care at first, but now it was clear that whatever that something was, it had pissed everyone off. The question became, what was that something? "I won't listen to anyone that's a bully." A bully? That was a difficult word in Bakugo's life. He was no stranger to its applied usage against him. His school might have been shitty and useless, but it did revere the very ground he walked on, and had provided no shortage of recommendation letters for him heading into UA. However, one word did appear a few times during conferences in which Bakugo paid it no heed, but it was a warning written for him moving forward. His personality, while ignored, was suggestive of bullying. The school had such a weak foundation that they had no stance on the bullying, especially against a student that might just bring them some sort of relevance. However, their guidance counselor had strong words of advice for the Bakugo family. He needs to learn that his actions have consequences, or the end result could be devastating toward his future. He tried to hide everything, you know? Protect you? What the fuck did that even mean? What sort of things could the lowly Deku be protecting anyone from? Begrudgingly, he'd come to a realization over the past few days. Deku was no small fry anymore. It pissed him off immensely to admit it, but Bakugo Katsuki was no idiot. He learned from his mistakes, because the best didn't make mistakes. The best didn't mess up, time and time again, like he had so far. Being captured by the League of Villains was his own fault. So was All Might's impromptu retirement. No matter how much he wanted to blame Deku, the fact of the matter was that he was responsible, not Deku. And yeah, it pissed him off. But not at Deku, specifically. Somehow, that runt had become collaborated with All Might. He wasn't daft, after all. He could still remember what Deku said to him the same day that he'd lost the battle training simulation. "I'm going to make this quirk my own." At first, That was a fucking insult, and one that Bakugo wouldn't readily forgive. It was a statement wrapped in mystery, basked in the shadows, and completely illegible. It made no sense. Then, everything began coming together, and while none of the other idiots in Class 1A were paying attention, he was. Maybe it was because of that quote, so maybe no one else could open their eyes wide enough to see the developments, or maybe they were too busy with their thumbs up their ass. It didn't really matter, in the end. Bakugo was finding the truth out, one by one, and it was nothing short of confusing as he discovered each new step. The connection between All Might, the world's greatest hero, and Deku was convoluted at best, with loose tendrils ominously hanging in the shadows, trying to be shielded from sight. But why? There was no figuring out their connection, Bakugo admitted. To discover the origins of their kinship would be nearly impossible without some sort of additional help or tip. And Deku had already given him a massive tip, as he'd later realize. What were initially words of mocking had turned into a revelation, though Bakugo couldn't figure out why the nerd even bothered opening his mouth. It was possible that it was still aimed as a mechanism of boasting, but somehow, the sandy-haired teen doubted it. There was too much truth. Truly, Deku hadn't possessed a quirk, he wasn't lying. But then, how did he possess one now? Slowly, Bakugo's thoughts trailed back to the looming, dangerous man that called himself All for One. He was the only one who'd rivaled All Might's strength, though in the end, he was a villain, and he lost, just as it was meant to be. But his quirk was unlike any quirk Bakugo had ever seen. He could steal and give quirks, which meant, was it possible that his intervention was behind Deku's sudden power? At this, Bakugo scoffed aloud. As if, he concluded sourly. The nerd was desperate for power, that much was true. He'd spent almost every waking moment of his pitiful existence looking for some iota of strength, but came up empty-handed each time. There was no chance that he'd impress that monster of a man enough to be given a quirk, especially considering his goals in life. But, if the walking potato could give quirks, then that would mean that others could too. You're next. How coincidental that Deku reacted differently than everyone else. How was his quirk so much alike All Might's? Was it possible? Bakugo. The teen's eyes snapped to upward, a disinterested look remained plastered on his face. He would not divulge anything until he knew what was going on. Yet, the look on Aizawa's face was unreadable. It wasn't the furious look he'd adopted earlier, nor was it merciful. It was simply stoic. To his side, Todoroki was a slight bit paler than normal, and his gaze was averted, though it lacked shame. As Bakugo stepped forward, and Todoroki stepped away, their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and in that second, Bakugo could see the true disdain that the half-and-half quirk user held. And, for a second, it actually worried him. Then Aizawa spoke lowly, and the thoughts slipped from his head, as his eyes focused on the man in front of him. Come with me. Psychiatric consultations. Fucking psychiatric consultations. That wasn't all though. That was only the beginning, in all truthfulness. Aizawa was direct in his quick interrogation. There was no bullshit, in which Bakugo appreciated, but there was also no room for a missed step. Anything that was said, needed meaning attached, or there was easily risk of expulsion, Bakugo could clearly see it. Perhaps, if it had been another teacher, he would have been expelled right on the spot. Bakugo was no idiot. He knew that his past had a chance of catching up to him. Looking back, he tried to keep his record clean. He didn't smoke with the two lackeys that addressed him as a friend, though. He had no desire to label them as such. He refused to drink with them, or even entertain the notion of anything illegal. Stealing, even as minor as shoplifting, remained on his list of do not do. He had little tolerance for their behavior, but ultimately, they fed his ego, and at times, even entertained him. They also encouraged his bad behavior, and he was no blind to what he'd said and done. He was a pompous asshole, and he knew that. Nobody else in the world might understand that he was aware, but then, they were probably waiting for some big apology and recognition of that, which he fucking refused to give them. His life was his own, and thus, his choices were also his own. Mistakes were made, but he knew that if he was going to be the best hero, he'd overcome them like All Might overcame everything in his path. Being reminded of his treatment toward Deku was nothing he didn't already remember. He could hardly forget the way the shrimp had quivered at the mere sight of him, nor could he forget the momentary look of defiance that would gleam in Deku's eyes, just before it was blown away by a literal explosion. He could hardly forget the way that he'd stood above the kid he'd thought to be a pebble, demoralizing him day after day, tormenting him physically and mentally, challenging him to step up, only to put him firmly into the dirt. There was no ignoring that, no forgetting that. It hadn't mattered either. Not at first, anyways. Their middle school had such a weak backbone, there was absolutely no chance that they'd risk penalizing him on the charges of bullying when they had the chance of being the middle school that Bakugo Katsuki, UA student, went to before making it big. They couldn't afford to risk it. So, they never confronted him. Now, he subtly wished they had. His reputation was fucked. There was no saving it. There was no going back. He was going to be known as the person that told fucking Deku, of all people, to jump off a rooftop and kill himself. Somehow, the entire class 1A knew of this, and there was absolutely no chance that they'd forget about it. He wanted to say that he didn't care. After all, they wouldn't stop his ascension to the #1 heroic spot. He'd be the best on his own. They wouldn't rise above him, nor would they hold him back. He wanted to say that he didn't care. Because why should he? Their opinions meant absolutely nothing to him. Well, if it isn't the giant asshole himself? Bakugo grit his teeth as he walked by a pink-skinned girl leaning against the wall as he rounded the corner. He'd just been trying to retreat to his dorm room so that he could file away all the information he'd been given by Aizawa. He didn't want to be pestered by another one of Deku's ridiculous sympathizers. Didn't they all have a campfire to gather around and sing at or some shit? With the way they were acting, it seemed plausible. You know, I knew you didn't like Midoriya. Hell, everyone with eyes could see you didn't like Midoriya. Her tone shifted. Begrudgingly, Bakugo remembered her name, Ashido. She had made it abundantly clear during the sports festival what her name was. It didn't mean he had to recognize it out loud. Her tone had changed, though. It was cold, steely, but not accusing like it had been just a second ago. And that made him pause momentarily. She waited a moment, and he imagined her silently judging him. But I don't get why anyone would want to be a hero after saying something like that. None of your fucking business, raccoon eyes. He didn't look at her, but he knew that she was scowling. Not that it mattered, of course. He was being truthful, it wasn't her damn business. She wasn't there. She only cared because of her own self-righteous, bullshit moral code she decidedly adopted. It wasn't her place to question his decisions in life, nor his aspirations. And, as expected, she hissed a reply. However, it wasn't the reply he'd been expecting. It became my business when you broke my friend. He wasn't quite sure what he'd been expecting, if he were completely honest. Maybe some bullshit, sap story about how someone told her the same things, or maybe about how it became her business because they were dating, or something like that. Something that clearly was still not her business, but she decided to be less of a coward than Deku, and come demand answers for her own personal satisfaction, and to quell her guilty conscience. But that was not on the list. And he felt his muscles stiffen as he processed her words. Yeah, you heard me. She said lowly, icicles on each of her words. He considered it, did you know that? Did you actually fucking think when you spoke, or did you just say whatever dim-witted idea came to mind? It didn't matter that she was insulting him, because for the moment he was actually lost in thought. There was a small part of his brain demanding that he lash out and tell her off, that it wasn't his problem what Deku did and didn't do. But that was false and he knew it. If Deku had followed his advice, for lack of a better term, it would have followed him. Forever. Deku's weakness was not his own, but he'd never actually considered that Deku would listen to anything he'd said. Hell, the runt had never acknowledged that anything he'd said made it past his thick skull, so why, suddenly, did those words change everything? I think I speak for the entire class when I say that we will not forgive you. Bakugo whirled on Ashido, not caring about the heat that had rushed to his face as he quietly pondered what had happened if Deku had jumped. Why the fuck are you all so insistent on protecting that nerd, huh? Can't he protect himself? He did protect himself. For God knows how long you bullied him, he had to protect himself. Ashido fired back. So why does everyone care now, huh? No one cared back then. No one dared step to his side. Why now? Why him? It has nothing to do with who it is. Ashido challenged back, meeting his glare and stepping forward vehemently. You are so fucking obsessed with Midoriya, and I don't get it. None of us do. It doesn't matter who you said it to. You could have said to literally anybody, and we'd feel the same. So it's because I said it, then? Bakugo's voice dropped to a low snarl. There was a dare, a challenge in his words. The muscles in his hands grew tight and he could feel the sweat pooling in his palms as he instinctively readied his quirk. He wouldn't attack first, but warnings be damned if she struck. You think I'm a villain? No. Again, she surprised him. Midoriya said something I think we all agree on. A villain is just someone who consciously makes bad choices, over and over because they want to hurt people. Making a bad choice doesn't make you a bad person. She stood firm for a moment, and then withdrew, her posture visibly tired. He snorted and took a mutual step back, eyeing her carefully. Do you think you're a villain? Momentarily, he was brought back to the League of Villains hideout, tied up in the chair, accused over and over of being a villain as they tried desperately to con him onto the losing side. The side he'd never seen eye to eye with. The side that he'd never be a part of. The side that had taken him, which led to his weakness becoming All Might's downfall. No, he snorted. He was no villain. Then why did you want to break him? Ashido asked softly. The anger from her voice had faded, and it sounded hollow compared to the fire that had burned before. Her eyes turned downcast as she turned her body posture inward, as if to protect her from some invisible cold. I wanted to remind him of where he stood, and that was in the ground. He was quirkless, believe it or not. Why does that matter? Because a quirkless runt can't be a hero. He would have died trying. So what? In your own messed up way, you were protecting him? Is that what I'm supposed to believe? Oh, I don't know. He cursed loudly, thoughts running rampant in his head. He had too much on his plate, too much going on. He couldn't think about lowly Deku and his hurt feelings right now. He had to figure other things out. Then why did you say it? Ashido asked quietly. Yet he didn't answer, instead, turning away and finishing the walk to his dorm room, leaving the question floating in the air. He didn't need to look at her to know she was confused and disappointed. He didn't need a mirror to know he was confused and disappointed. Because, looking back on the incident, he replayed the moment over and over in his head, wondering where it had all come from in the first place. And the more he tried to think back, point his finger somewhere, the more he realized he just didn't know. He had no answer. There was no singular, definitive reason that he'd said what he said. And he knew that wasn't right. He didn't want to care that his entire class knew the truth, and he didn't want to care that they hated him. But deep, deep down he did care. For the next 2 weeks, everything was very awkward, at least in the eyes of Midoriya Izuku. There was a tense atmosphere that had descended upon the inhabitants of Class 1A, and while it was once unheard of, it wasn't unexpected, especially once secrets began to unravel. And, for the most part, Midoriya felt somewhat foolish for thinking he could hide something from his friends for all 3 years he'd be at U, especially something that involved someone else in the manner that it did. He was just grateful that One for All remained a closely knit secret. With how dangerous the quirk was, especially with its warped history, there was nothing good that could come from it being thrust into the open. And if this ordeal had taught him anything, he would begin playing his cards even closer, seeing as how neither secret was even meant to open to the prying eyes of the public. Obviously, he hadn't meant to oust anything in the first place. His rationality had been bogged by sleep, and it just seemed welcoming to share his fears aloud, instead of internalizing them for a change. The alienation of Bakugo had never been his intention. Without even meaning to, Midoriya had united the entirety of 1A, even the students that typically didn't see eye to eye, Mineta and pretty much everyone else, were on the same page when it came to Bakugo. Static seemed to resonate through the room whenever he entered, and upon until the moment he'd leave in a huff, there'd been an impending sense of doom that befell the room. Quirks, for the most part, were banned outside of training facilities while on UA property, but something told Midoriya that if push came to shove, and it would, Quirks would be activated without second thought, and the fallout would only be managed by Aizawa and the threat of expulsion. A small part of Midoriya was flattered and relieved, if he were being completely honest with himself. There had been an overwhelming number of anxiety-driven thoughts that all circled around the same premise. What if everyone turned on him and ostracized him? What if it was just like his middle school again, and the entirety of the class picked Bakugo over him? The fact that it wasn't like middle school at all shushed his anxiety, albeit slightly, and it gave him temporary solace. But it did nothing to quell the guilt that had been building up by the day. Because even though no one had turned on him, they'd all turned on Bakugo instead. And honestly, that was no better in his mind. He'd approached Ida and Uraraka concerning his fears, but to his dismay, though not his surprise, they brushed off his concerns rather passively, opting to reassure him, which isn't what he was seeking. And, in honesty, he knew that no one was going to really hear him out. Nobody really shared the connection he had with Bakugo as children. Thus, no one could sympathize the same way. Class 1A only knew Bakugo for his anger, his passion, but as of now, his bully history. They didn't know Bakugo as Kaken. Nobody, that is, except Kirishima. The red-haired teenager peeked up from the book he was, regrettably, reading, a look of relief washing over his face as he caught sight of Midoriya. Whether or not that relief stemmed from his salvation from the homework, or something else, that much was beyond Midoriya. Still, he wouldn't pretend that Kirishima's smile hadn't put him slightly at ease for the pending conversation. Midoriya. What's up, bro? His words were so easily spoken, so relaxed. Subconsciously, Midoriya's fist tightened. What if this conversation went wrong? What if Kirishima wouldn't help either? Help with what? Midoriya blinked. He'd been muttering again. He sighed. No use backing out now. I had a question for you, if you don't mind me asking? Jovially, Kirishima slammed his book closed, not even bothering to mark the page he'd been previously engrossed in. Surely that would come back to bite him later, but for now, Midoriya had bigger things on his mind. A large, sharp-toothed grin spread evenly across Kirishima's face as he leaned forward, completely enraptured by the unasked question. It was almost like he'd been waiting for someone to come and save him from the torture of the homework. But for Midoriya, he was wishing he could be doing homework instead. He'd do homework nonstop if it meant escaping the world he was currently trapped within. With a swipe of his hand, Midoriya combed his fingers through his hair, took a seat and rested his hand on the back of his head, before nervously scratching at it as he averted his eyes downward. A nervous smile, more nervous than smile to the average onlooker, punctuated the question, and for a brief few seconds, Midoriya felt all the confidence he'd built up during his time at UA fade away. What do you think of, Kaken? Kirishima blinked, clearly not prepared for the sudden whirlwind of words. His smile dimmed a touch, but turned a hint more compassionate as he leaned forward and lowered his voice ever so slightly. You mind slowing that blender down, bro? I could barely understand ya. From behind his arms, which he'd thrown up for protection instinctively as he'd blurted his question, Midoriya turned a hint of red and slowly dropped his mock defenses. Mentally, he cursed himself, ribbing his lack of confidence. How would All Might feel, knowing you're unable to ask even as simple questions? He lectured internally. With a sigh, he re-prepared himself, feeling the balloon of anxiety spread larger in his chest. Oh, what do you think of Kaken? There was a moment of silence. The balloon grew bigger, and for a second, Midoriya was afraid that his nerves were going to get the best of him, as he felt anxious enough to throw up. Which, in hindsight, would not be a good idea. He dropped his head, fear taking over his thought process. He hadn't expected much, but he'd figured if anyone could held the predicament, it would be Bakugo's first true friend at UA. But then, he miss him. Midoriya looked up, a part of his brain wondering if he'd simply misheard his red-haired friend. He blinked once, staring at Kirishima, who had also looked down. Ga! He suddenly shouted, throwing his head back and covering his face with his palms. That action, paired with his rougher noise, likely would have earned him a few stares from anyone nearby, but thankfully, the common room in the dorms was unoccupied at the moment, giving the two all the peace and quiet they needed. I'm sorry. Kirishima slammed a fist on the table, while dropping his other arm, in favor of letting that hand fall leisurely into his lap. An uneasy look crossed his face and he let out a long, drawn-out sigh. I feel shitty admitting this, to you of all people. But Bakugo was a friend, you know? I know what he did was wrong. It was terrible. But you got to know him as your friend here. Not as what he was, there, Midoriya finished quietly, a small smile appearing as he folded his hands on the table. Right? Kirishima said loudly, leaning forward with emphasis. His excitement died down immediately, though, as thoughts seemed to rush through his head. From his spot, Midoriya could easily see the guilt that leaked from Kirishima's expression, and a part of his subconscious felt guilty, having been responsible for the division between friends. He'd never intended for any of this. Obviously, if it were up to his decision, he'd go back and reverse everything that had happened. Starting from the day at Yaoyorozu's mansion. Having established deeper friendships with everyone had been nice, and he felt so much more in touch with everyone as a result, but having Bakugo's connection with everyone completely severed, especially when he'd been starting to open up and make friends in his own way, it made his heart ache with guilt. He'd rather bear his history alone than destroy someone's future. That admission of guilt was all Midoriya needed in order to push his consciousness forward with his plan. I get it, you know the way you feel, Midoriya said softly, looking down at his hands. He could feel Kirishima's confused gaze on him, but he didn't bother looking up. He didn't trust himself at the moment. I know that everyone thinks I should hate Kaken. But I don't think they get it. I mean, he was definitely a bully. But before that, we were friends? Kirishima remained silent, simply taking Midoriya's explanation in. In truth, he'd never really received any reasoning behind Bakugo and Midoriya's odd rivalry, and only had the idea that they'd previously had the rivalry in middle school. Obviously, that had been tossed out the window with recent revelations, but there was still always the lingering thought of why Midoriya even defended Bakugo. And for Kirishima, he knew that Bakugo was a volatile person, but he had a heart. It wasn't always the most obvious, but the further they got in the school year, the more Bakugo began thinking of other people. His ego was shrinking, if at least by a little, and his tolerance toward the general class had increased. He even took time during the day to silently sit with large social groups, which he'd never done. A long, long time ago. Before he got his quirk. We both wanted to be heroes, like All Might. And we had that goal, together. Midoriya sniffed, trying to ignore the tears that he felt prickle his eyelids as he recalled those days. When he got his quirk, that's when it changed. I can't forget how I looked up to him. How he was the strongest person in my life. He was the closest to All Might I saw. For a moment, Midoriya paused, unable to continue. He hadn't forgotten why he'd looked up to his once friend, and every time he spoke of it, he was reminded of the pride that Bakugo had. He couldn't forget when the blonde stood up to bullies that no one else dared fight, and like any fan of All Might, he'd refused to lose. It was everything that Midoriya had ever wanted to be. He's an ass, you know, Kirishima said quietly. But when Midoriya looked up, the redhead had a small smile on his face. Really, he's kind of a jerk, but he's still a bro. He saved my ass at the UC. Really, I dunno if I would have made it out without him. And since then, I've really come to respect that tenacity he's got. He wouldn't be Kaken without that, Midoriya said lightly, both of the teens ignoring his hiccup as he tried to suppress his emotions. There was a silence that took over, and for a fleeting moment, neither party knew what to say. I can't really forgive him. Midoriya blinked in surprise. Wah? I can't forgive him. He really messed up, you know? Bro or not, you can't say that stuff. You can't be that stuff. I know you're just trying to protect him, Midoriya. And that's what makes you awesome, you know? Kirishima looked at Midoriya, a toothy smile on his face. But yet, it didn't feel like a warm, happy smile. In fact, it felt kind of sad. He's gotta go through this, because he's gotta learn that it isn't okay to be what he was. But Midoriya frowned, the conversation taking a drastic turn from the direction he'd anticipated it going. Out of everyone in Class 1A, Kirishima was the last person he expected to stand by the decision to let Bakugo suffer in silence. The bond they'd forged, the things that Kirishima had sacrificed to get Bakugo back on their side. They were friends. True, genuine friends. It's not that it's easy, man. Kirishima broke their eye contact, clenching a fist as he did so. I don't want to do this. But Midoriya, bro. You have to look at this from someone else's viewpoint. You gotta be impartial. I was kinda thinking like you too, but then Yamamo explained everything and it makes sense. Yamamo? Impartial? Midoriya frowned, unable to put the pieces all together. Perhaps it was the emotion he felt, or maybe it was simply because he hadn't heard what she had to say, but he had a hard time imagining anything making sense. If you ignore what he did then, what message does that send to him and a younger you? Younger me? Kirishima finally looked back up, and when he did, Midoriya felt his heart lock up at the emotion within the redhead's eyes. There was definitely guilt swimming in those orbs. But there was so much more, and for a fleeting second, Midoriya felt as if Kirishima did truly understand him. And so, he listened. Somewhere in this world, there's another you and another Bakugo. I mean, what we do with Bakugo here and now doesn't change the quirkless kid and his tormentors now, but it's a message that it isn't okay, Kirishima explained. But Midoriya shot back in an instant. I don't want him to be an example. It's not about being an example, Kirishima retorted, his emotions finally slipping into his words. Anger and guilt, remorse, and a mixture of several other emotions began pouring into his words as his volume rose. It's about getting him better. People don't just tell people to jump from rooftops. This isn't just about one thing. It's about a lifetime of things that went unchecked. Bro, he needs help. And it wasn't as if Midoriya didn't agree with that. If anything, he wholeheartedly agreed. But the way they went about it wasn't right. At least, not to Midoriya. Isolating him won't help any. And what will? Ignoring it? Midoriya opened his mouth, fueled by his inner fire, but the second the words reached his tongue, his voice failed. And, for the second, he didn't know why he couldn't speak. But as his brain finally caught up, he realized he was wrong. And, slowly, he closed his mouth, his posture shifting to withdraw in on himself. Ignoring it, that's what had led to the mess in the first place. Bakugo was improving, steadily. He was learning lessons. He was getting better. But it came at a price. Each time, he was falling further and further behind everyone else. He'd almost failed the midterm exam. He failed the provisional hero license. While his quirks' strength, application, and versatility had continued to increase, and his own skills developed even further, he'd been left to develop as a person on his own, for the most part. And yes, while he was growing, it only came when he failed remarkably. How long would it be until Bakugo failed at something he couldn't afford to fail at? How much failure would it take for him to learn his lessons he should have already been taught? Ignoring the problem wouldn't help, at all. If anything, it would confuse him. Was it okay? Was it not okay? Midoriya, bro, I hate this. I really, really do. But he's gotta learn why he said that stuff. Why he did that stuff. Then, he maybe will be in a position to forgive him. Why had he done everything? Midoriya felt his world began to fade to the background as he silently contemplated what Kirishima said. He's gotta learn why he said that stuff. Truthfully, Midoriya had never really considered the whys of anything. He had just ignored or forgiven Bakugo's attitude toward him because that was just the type of person he was. Beyond that, he knew what Bakugo had once been, and part of him was likely hoping for some sort of return to that. In the end, Izuku had never once actually considered the driving reason behind Bakugo's actions. He knew they were inspired from a massive ego and superiority complex. But why? Why did Izuku Midoriya, quirkless wonder until recently, inspire those reactions so intensely? Why had he driven Bakugo to want to torment him daily? Was it because they shared the same dreams? Was it something beyond that? Later that night, after numbly excusing himself from Kirishima, to the redhead's concern, Midoriya wouldn't be seen at dinner, as he blankly laid on his bed, trying to decipher an entire childhood's worth of memories, picking apart at each scarred and broken memory. Each time, he failed to find a why, and slowly, Midoriya began wondering if there even was a why. And all the while, he was just left wondering, what did I do to deserve it? Midoriya hated the nights that he couldn't sleep. The way his blanket would stick to his skin, sticky and glistening with sweat, and the way he'd toss and turn hopelessly, trying to find some glimmer of comfort, caused him endless frustration. Mostly, he hated the sensation of sweat. However, it also reminded him of the time before UA and all the struggles that had dominated his social life. It took him back to a place that was dark and hopeless. He tried to forget about it as much as he could. Really, he'd done everything he could to suppress it. He'd tried meditation, he'd tried psychotherapy, he'd tried simply ignoring it, but the more he tried, the more he found himself drawn back to the old reality of how his life had been. And that frustrated him even further than the sensation of being sweaty. Each time, he'd grumble and curse lightly to himself, kick the blankets off his body, which made him feel just marginally better, and he'd fill up a bottle of water, in anticipation for a light, or possibly heavy, session at the gym. He'd always do his best to avoid staying awake too late. Most times, he ended up simply doing a few quick power lifts in effort to wear himself down a bit, and quiet his hyperactive imagination. Once in a while, he settled for running on a treadmill, knowing Aizawa would kill him if he was caught outside of the dorms during curfew. Still, at the end of the day, he kept coming back to the same problem, with the same feeble solution. And while hate was a strong word, he certainly loathed the moments he found himself separated from the waiting grasp of rest. That's how he found himself staring out the window, longing for the cool caress of the autumn air. The tiniest part of his brain debated slipping outside, consequences be damned. He knew there were obviously steep repercussions for being caught past curfew, but he also was a touch sleep-deprived, and for once, he didn't particularly care about them. All he wanted was a subtle bit of breeze, and perhaps something to clear his mind. He glanced at his clock, then back outside. Instinctively, he gnawed gently on his bottom lip, debating the pro and con of sneaking out. Better not let Ida see me, Midoriya mumbled to himself, sighing as he tossed on a pair of clean shorts and a simple shirt. Common sense, like many times recently in his life, had lost this time. Gently, he closed his door and lightly tread down the hallway, being mindful of any stirring from any room he passed by. Thankfully, or regrettably, there was no noise from any room, and he made his way to the common area, before giving one last gaze to his surroundings. Then he slipped outside and felt immediately better. There had always been the option of opening a window, but this was so much more rewarding. He felt the tension he'd been carrying begin to relax, his muscles releasing as the trickle of a breeze swam past his legs, barely jostling his loose-fitting shorts. He took a deep breath in, holding for a second, before releasing. Filled with energy, he trekked forward, letting some leaves crackle under each footstep. Truthfully, there had been a lot on his mind as of late. Sure, he always had the lingering thoughts about All Might and the destiny he'd inherited. The weight of All Might's words, legacy, and power laid on his shoulders, and his shoulders alone. But no, that wasn't it this time. Since his conversation with Kirishima, he'd been deep in thought about the redhead's words, and how they applied to his circumstances. Since Kirishima had spoken, the words hadn't stopped echoed within Midoriya's mind. He's gotta learn why he said that stuff. While it made sense, it really didn't make sense either. For the longest time, essentially since Midoriya could remember Bakugo first developing his ego problem, he'd always just assumed that Bakugo was a pompous ass. It was rather blunt, but it failed to become less true as they both grew older. And, with his ego, it was just assumed that Bakugo was going to talk down on anyone he saw to be below him. Which, unfortunately, was everyone. But the way that Kirishima spoke, it made Midoriya hesitate. Each time the greenette thought that he'd developed an answer toward Kirishima's statement, he found himself looking at his answer with disdain. Just because Bakugo had an ego, it didn't mean that he had to pick him of all people to belittle. If it had to do with him being quirkless, then the next question was, why did it matter? If it was because of his goal and aspiration, the following question was, what did that have to do with Bakugo? No matter how many questions he answered, he found himself asking a new question, and then struggling with the answer. It was, for lack of a better term, painfully repetitive. It was tedious. And it was unending. There was likely correlation between these circling answers and his recent restless nights. There'd been moments of indecision, where Midoriya had considered bringing the topic up with a professional, or at least, someone who was an adult. Aizawa, while stern and cool on the exterior, was fairly level-headed, and might shed some sort of light on the silent battle within Midoriya's mind. Though, he also might just sigh and refer to hound dog services. And not that the school counselor wasn't helpful, because anyone who was able to assist prospective hero students through the worst parts of their lives was bound to be good, but Midoriya was hesitant simply because he didn't know hound dog. If he was to be honest, he'd rather talk to someone he knew. While he was positive that All Might would be more than willing to listen, he also knew that All Might wasn't the best with words or advice. Truly, he loved his predecessor and held all the respect possible for him, but realistically, Midoriya knew All Might was only halfway decent with his words. Still, it crossed the young boy's mind to give it a shot anyways. After all, maybe the large man would have some sort of surprisingly sage wisdom? An explosion rang out in the dead of night, the booming echoing sending a shiver down Midoriya's spine as he felt his instincts flare up. His fists clenched, and his muscles tightened, in anticipation of the blow that never came. Without even realizing, his eyes had closed, and slowly he opened his eyes, scowling to himself as he did so. It was always the unseen blows that hurt the most, he'd realized early in life. With Bakugo's quirk, if he could see the attack incoming, he could brace himself quickly enough, he could expect the pain. But the worst moments were the ones he didn't see coming. He'd come to fear the unseen, and by extension, had developed a paranoia to explosions when he didn't expect them. Or at least, he categorized it as a paranoia. He didn't know what else to call it. Kaken? Midoriya wondered idly, seeing a small trail of smoke rise from one of Yuda's mock cities. It wasn't too far away, Midoriya realized, glancing back toward the dorms in the distance. He'd been so lost in thought he hadn't realized how far he'd walked. Faintly, he could smell the smoke that hung in the air, a sign that this explosion hadn't been the first of its kind. He knew he should turn around and head back to the dorms. His brain told him it was time to head back. He didn't need to see his tormentor, his friends had made that clear. Avoid Bakugo. But it was like a magnetic pull, yearning him forward. The tug, whether it was his heart telling him to confront his old friend, or his brain feeding an old habit, lured him toward the column of smoke, pushing him with a thoughtless command. His brain had almost stopped functioning, as it always did when it came to situations such as these. Why am I going there? What is it that I'm looking for? There are no answers there, there's nothing there. Just Kaken. Another explosion, this time, louder than the previous one, rang out, though Midoriya didn't flinch the same as before. Partially, he'd been expecting another, and now that he knew of the location, his brain was more at ease. Though, he still felt his hair stand on end as he drew closer. His heart rate picked up as his nerves became more pronounced. He's gotta learn why he said that stuff. Will I? A third explosion, the smoke and fire now visible upon detonation, thundered across the fake city, and Midoriya felt something stir within as he finally made out his old friend's form. The blonde was hunched over, heaving and panting, his palms facing upward as he gasped deeply. There was a look of unadulterated frustration on his face, which was twisted into a venomous scowl as he cursed loudly, clenching his fists as he did so. Why won't these thoughts just? Several small pops bounced around Bakugo's palms, before he roared out, "Go away." His words were punctuated by a massive detonation, causing the earth to tremble as the vibrations ran throughout the city. Midoriya winced as he saw the grimace of pain briefly shoot across the boy's face, before being swept away by another round of anger. His hands shot into the sky again, and his eyes narrowed as he took a breath in. For a brief second, Midoriya expected Bakugo to unleash another torrent of explosions. However, the volatile teen seemed to hesitate a second, and dropped his hands, an unreadable expression crossing his face. He huffed angrily, opting to throw himself rather violently into a sitting position. Then, his head twisted quickly, and his eyes met Midoriya's. It was then that the green-haired teenager realized he hadn't stopped walking, and he'd subconsciously approached the same person he'd been told to avoid. The fuck do you want? It was surprisingly tame, compared to what Midoriya had been expecting. Then again, he wasn't exactly sure what to expect. Perhaps an explosion to his face? Sorry. I was just walking. Midoriya stammered out, realizing he'd intruded. I'll just go. He turned, unsure why he'd even been drawn to this place in the first place. Really, he couldn't figure it out. It was as if his heart and brain had acted in some weird unison, prodding him to this spot, to say something and find some answer. And now that he was here, there was nothing. No questions, no comments, no anger. Nothing. Just the urge to get away. Wait. And just like that, he stopped. It was like his muscles were controlled by some small contraption, and that device was held by the blonde teenager. But he didn't turn around, he didn't dare face the angry red eyes that were surely glaring at him. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Answer something for me. It wasn't a question, but then, why would it be, Midoriya wondered. Bakugo didn't ask things from people, he demanded them. Do you remember this place? Well, it's something of a question, I guess. Midoriya corrected internally. He sighed, and then looked around. At first, nothing came to mind. It was one of the mock cities, but not the mock city that he'd taken his practical exam in, nor the same mock city that he and the boy behind him had fought All Might in. It was unremarkable, really. Perhaps they'd done a class assignment here at some point during the semester, but there was nothing specific enough to make Midoriya remember it off the top of his head. Turn around, Nadash, Bakugo hesitated, cutting his sentence off. And that was enough to cause Midoriya to stiffen in surprise, because Bakugo Katsuki didn't hesitate. After a second, Bakugo spoke again. Just turn around. And so he did. And deep down, something clicked as he looked at the building behind Bakugo. It was tall, yes, but no different than any other building except there were cracks in its framing that seemed to have been reinforced and patched over by Cementos at some point. Cracks from a quirk. From a super-strength quirk. This is... Midoriya mumbled. Bakugo sniffed. The place you beat me. The first time you ever beat me. And the first time you ever used your quirk against me. He said the word quirk with such disdain, Midoriya wondered if he was going to actually spit on the ground. But alas, he didn't. He simply stared with unmasked anger. You beat me. Then, do you remember what you said after? Did he remember? Midoriya thought back, trying to recall exactly what he said. One day I will make this quirk my own and beat you with my own power. Bakugo recited coldly. He scowled. It was an insult then. A fucking mockery of me. But I realized better. You weren't just boasting, you were telling me something. That power, it's his, isn't it? His? Midoriya's eyes widened. His heart rate immediately picked up. Had Bakugo actually figured out his secret? All Might. That power, it's All Might's, isn't it? His voice was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't Bakugo's. But it wasn't. Midoriya couldn't remember the last time he'd heard the blonde speak so controlled. The usual anger that laced his words together was absent, and it made him sound so much different. But as much as he wanted to focus on that, he couldn't simply ignore Bakugo's implications or question. And he certainly couldn't ignore how his old friend had seemingly put the pieces together. That one line, though, couldn't have given it all away, could it? There had to be something else. There had to be more. Kaken was observant, Midoriya could easily admit that. But there was more to this deduction, there had to be. Before I answer that, what makes you think that I got a quirk from All Might? Bakugo's nose twitched, and a flicker of anger passed across his features, before he exhaled heavily, and the emotion slipped from his expression. For one, I'm not a damn idiot. You and him have the same power. He seems to give you extra attention. You reacted different than anyone when he retired, and you were there, way back when he stopped that sludge asshole. You were there, and he was too. Why would that make a difference? Because after that day you changed? Had he changed? Being honest, he hadn't really stopped to evaluate himself personally from that day onward. Ever since becoming All Might's disciple, He'd been focused on improving his body in order to handle the power that had been made known to him as One for All. He hadn't even remotely considered his personality changing with his body. If anything, he thought he was about the same. Perhaps a touch more talkative, but nothing else. But had he changed? To an outsider, maybe he had. To someone who watched him but never saw his regime, perhaps he had changed? To Kaken, who had spent a lifetime torturing him in small, but daily methods, picking on the spineless boy he'd been, maybe he had grown somewhat? You weren't just a quirkless wannabe anymore. You didn't follow anyone anymore. You stopped searching, you looked like you'd found something. Like some fucking realization had struck you. That flicker of anger popped back onto Bakugo's face, and he struggled to ease it away, this time. At first, I thought you were finally growing up, but then, you pissed me off more. You still wanted to go to UA and you still wanted to be a fucking hero. Why? Bakugo tilted his head, unsure of if he'd actually heard Midoriya speak or not. Why? Why did it matter? The words tumbled from Midoriya's mouth without him even meaning to speak. But, then again, they were the sole reason that had driven him forward, the same thing that brought him outside in the first place. The same thing that had driven sleep away. The answer he was looking for. And he knew the only person who would have the answers he was looking for stood directly in front of him. Fear couldn't afford to paralyze him now, he needed answers. Bakugo's sneer became slightly more pronounced. Because you were quirkless, and you couldn't win a fight? There's more to being a hero than fighting, Midoriya countered. And, of course, he believed his words. But, even with that simple phrase, that simple answer, he found pieces beginning to settle into place. Within his brain, the clouds began to shift, and the stars of recognition became just a little less convoluted. Suddenly, there was an answer in sight, for the first time since the questions had been posed. What kind of hero loses? Finally, it seemed, Bakugo was back to his normal demeanor, as he lashed out suddenly. His ruby eyes held the stubbornness they always held, but as Midoriya locked gazes, he noticed they seemed less certain than usual. There was something off about his tone, about his posture. What kind of hero can't fight? Midoriya opened his mouth to speak, but found his words drowned out by Bakugo's sudden tirade. You could never be a hero, because you were hopeless. Because you couldn't win. You, a quirkless Deku, wanted to be like All Might, and that was such bullshit. It was a fucking disgrace. It happened without meaning, he really hadn't meant for it to happen. But, inevitably, there were some things that Midoriya had unconsciously picked up from watching Bakugo for so many years. And this was one of them. That's bullshit. Midoriya lashed out, his own anger flaring. It was almost enough to cause Bakugo to recoil. Almost. But it was enough to halt the blonde's rant, giving Midoriya a moment to get a word in, letting his anger take the driver's seat for a change. Heroes aren't heroes because they fight, they're heroes because they protect people. They protect the innocent, All Might protects people. I didn't want to be a hero to fight, I wanted to be a hero to stand up for innocent people. To save them with a smile. It was almost therapeutic, Midoriya would later realize. His anger, justified or not, had rarely been allowed to escape in his words, and it showed. It wasn't something he was good at. It was draining. Letting all that rage seep from his body, like a poison leaking from his pores. It was weight he never even knew he carried, but as soon as it was in the open, he felt his shoulders sag from the pressure that was lifted. But before he knew it, another round of anger was rearing its ugly face as more and more feelings cropped up. Why did you pick me? Midoriya hollered, unconsciously calling upon One for All. The biokinetic electricity danced around his figure, illuminating him in a faint intimating hue. Out of everyone you picked me. I might have been quirkless, but that's no excuse. Why me? Bakugo didn't answer, but then again, Midoriya wasn't ready for an answer at that moment, regardless of his question. His anger had reached its tipping point, like a pot overflowing, his rage demanded compensation. He hadn't even realized he was reacting, until he realized he'd rushed forward at Bakugo, lashing out with a wicked sidekick. The strike missed, as Bakugo leapt backward, using a dimmed explosion to propel his movement backward. Despite realizing he'd essentially attacked his classmate unprovoked, Midoriya didn't stop to debate whether he'd acted in the wrong. Instead, he hissed and prepared himself for Bakugo's counterattack, which came in the form of an aerial assault. The green-haired teen performed a backflip, using his foot to deflect the outstretched hand and redirect the explosion away from his body. Bakugo glared as he tumbled to the ground, before lunging forward again with blazing speed. "He's not giving me time to think," Midoriya realized suddenly, barely landing on his feet, before being forced to jump back to avoid the blast radius of the explosion. Smoke and ash filled the air, masking Bakugo's figure and clouding their makeshift battlefield. Then, a sharp pain erupted in his torso, as he was sent careening to the side, courtesy of a direct punch from a hidden Bakugo. As he hit the ground, he rolled and regained his footing quickly enough to dive forward out of the way of another aerial attack. With his back to Bakugo, an image flashed in Midoriya's mind, back to their days in middle school when the blonde would place a palm on his shoulder and burn his shirt to leave a warning. Instinct, whether it was raw or trained, Midoriya didn't have time consider which kicked in, and Midoriya did a full 180, using the dorsum of his foot to catch Bakugo in the face, who'd been aiming for another sneak attack. The kick sent the sandy-haired teenager off balance, resulting in a mistimed explosion. Bakugo hit the ground but this time, skid across the asphalt, and grunted loudly. It was just the break that Midoriya needed for his sanity to take back control, as he realized he'd pretty much just started an all-out brawl between the two. Kaken. He prepared to move forward, but Bakugo's vehement response stopped him in his tracks. "Stop it." There was a moment of silence between the two, as Midoriya stopped mid-stride, his hand slightly outstretched, as if to offer it to the downed frenemy. Bakugo remained on the ground, using his arm to wipe away a small trail of blood that leaked from his temple, courtesy of the roundhouse kick. "Just fucking stop." He exhaled thickly, the glare still pronounced. "Stop coddling me, damn it. I fucking tormented you. I hated you. I struck you again and again. I burned you, bruised you, beat you, and you still came back. You always came back. Like you were looking down on me. And yet, you still act like you have to protect me." It wasn't anger. At least, not his normal anger. Midoriya slowly dropped his hand, taking in the words as Bakugo's feelings slowly came out. Just as his anger had emerged without his meaning, pouring out like a water from a crack in the dam, the feelings that began escaping from the explosive teenager were unintended. His voice became strained, and an unfamiliar shine pooled in his eyes. The two, separated by only a few feet, stared at one another, neither willing or able to speak. For a second, it reminded the both of them the first time they'd ever ended up in this same position, the day on the river. It seemed like a lifetime ago. For Bakugo, he could remember the ache he'd felt when he landed in the water. And for Midoriya, he could remember the thrum of his heart against his ribs as he saw his then-friend land in the water. For any two others, it wouldn't have been anything, but for Bakugo, it was the first time he ever felt that he was being looked down upon. And it was the moment that cemented, for the both of them, their constant struggle in each other's lives. "I'm not fucking helpless," Bakugo hissed quietly. "And you don't need to protect me. I don't want your fucking protection. I don't need it." All those years? Had he really thought? Is that? Each burn, each bruise, each abrasion, cut, blister, welt, each and every physical and mental wound, was inflicted upon him, all because he tried to help? Is that really what you thought? Bakugo stared defiantly at Midoriya, unflinching. And, throughout their short exchange, Midoriya's face had been mostly unreadable, though concern was the primary emotion. Now, his blank look had broken, and all that was left was confusion. You always defied me. Even though I was supposed to become the hero, you always tried to upstage me. You couldn't leave it alone, even without a quirk, you refused to stop. I tried to show you, no hero loses, and stays the hero. If you can't win a fight, you're nothing. But you wouldn't stop, you wouldn't quit. And I hated that. Your fucking ignorance, you were always right there, trying to follow me. Even though it was hopeless. Why? Why did? Midoriya's voice cracked. He hesitated, unable to put his thoughts into words. Why did you try to break me? I don't know. It wasn't an answer, both teenagers knew that. But it was equally frustrating, though neither party would realize others' true frustrations. It was impossible after all. Locked in their own pains, they wouldn't be able to experience empathy for the other's situation without closure in their own. And that's what pisses me off. I don't fucking know. I tried to fucking break you. Fuck. Small crackles appeared in Bakugo's hands as he aggressively stood up, stomping as he did so. It didn't sate his anger in the slightest, and he growled as the frustration simply grew within his chest. I almost fucking killed you, and I almost fucking killed All Might, and I don't dash. An explosion went off, aimed at his feet. Fucking. Another explosion. Get it? He heaved heavily, drawing in deep breaths, whether to calm his rage, or because he'd literally blown through his stamina. It was a mystery to Midoriya, and dropped his gaze to the ground, shielding his eyes. His body trembled ever so slightly, and with widened eyes, Midoriya realized he was crying. Conflict ran rampant through the greenette's mind. His natural instinct urged him to go to Bakugo's side, to comfort his friend-turned-bully. Regardless of what the teenager was to him, the fact remained, heroes don't discriminate. But, yet his rationality spoke loud and clear. It wouldn't alleviate any of the feelings that either party felt toward one another. In fact, it would probably worsen their already fragile relationship. Strangely, Midoriya wasn't mad. He was frustrated, no doubt. He'd come for answers, and quite frankly, he hadn't really found any sort of closure at all. The only thing he discovered really only added to his questions and uncertainty. It wasn't helpful, not in the slightest. But, for some reason he wasn't mad. Perhaps it was because rage wasn't his typical response. Or perhaps he also didn't know. That was the problem, wasn't it? Nobody knew, and the more he'd thought about it, the more he'd wondered if anyone would know. No matter how many psychologists existed, there was probably no one in the world that would ever be able to provide an explanation of why things occurred the way they did. Sure, Bakugo had been spoiled senseless. His ego had been spoon-fed pretty much since birth. He'd never been reprimanded for a thing. And he'd been touted as the next great hero. But Midoriya himself knew he'd been part of that disastrous equation. He, too, had fed that ego. And he'd refused to let Bakugo get in trouble. And, like everything else, he had touted Bakugo as the next great hero. He was part of the broken system, too. What pisses me off the most? Bakugo started again, impossibly quiet, especially for him. All our shitty classmates keep fucking asking, why, and I have no fucking clue. That shitty counselor asks me why, and I have no fucking idea. Then you ask me and I fucking remember saying it. And I remember saying it to get some sort of fucking reaction from you. To get you to acknowledge you were below me. All some sort of sick fucking move to demoralize you and cause you to finally lose. The hero always wins. That was Bakugo's mentality. Even from a young age, Midoriya recognized that drive. For the longest time, even following him to you, that mentality stood as a constant driving force in Midoriya's life. It was part of what drove Midoriya to beat plus ultra, as the school's motto went. He'd always followed Bakugo's attitude on winning, because in both of their eyes, a hero didn't lose. The difference between the two of them was now clear as day, but what good would that do either of them? But I don't know why I wanted to it that badly. And that's what pisses me off the most. And then, I wonder, have I always been wrong? All Might picked you, fucking you, of all people. He acknowledged, not me. And now, I realize how fucking far behind I am, and I realize everyone was wrong. So why? Midoriya blinked as Bakugo finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. Why was I the one who ended All Might? Why was I the one who almost ended you? It didn't need to be spoken, for Midoriya to understand. He finally understood. The clouds in his brain had finally cleared. The constellation made sense. For Kaken, he's always been told one way. He's always seen one thing. I was an opposing force. The foil to his vision. The contradiction. Naturally, anyone who believed one thing, but had someone who existed as its opposite, would come to despise the existence of that exception. And, truly, over time, most people would stop following around someone who continued to berate them, physically and mentally. But, was I wrong about everything? Why was I the wrong one in everything? I had nothing. For the longest time, I had nothing. And Kaken had everything. The quirk. An obtainable dream. A support system. To me, to a quirkless kid, he was the closest thing to All Might I had in my life. That's why. Why did you keep following me? Why didn't you stay down? Maybe I was his exception, the proof he wasn't completely right, but even so, he had everything I didn't. Of course I'd follow him. Of course I'd look up to him, because he had everything I wanted to be. And if defying him was to defy his vision, his beliefs, if that made me the target, then there's nothing I could do. After everything, why do you keep trying to protect me? There was no answer. There was no sentence that Midoriya could string together in order to placate Bakugo's conflicted feelings. And with the traffic jam in his brain, Midoriya doubted he'd be able to even put together his feelings enough to respond in the first place. In Bakugo's anger, there was something that hadn't been there before: guilt. It was masked with the layers upon layers on anger beyond it, but Midoriya could hear the crack in his friend's tone as they stared at one another. A breeze, faint as it was, tumbled through the empty street, bringing the smell of smoke with it. It brought Midoriya back to the time he'd saved Bakugo from the sludge villain. He hadn't understood Bakugo's vehement response to his intervention, simply, he'd written it off as Kaken being Kaken. But was it different now? You wanted me to lose? Midoriya's voice was soft, a stark contrast to how their conversation had been up until he spoke. Between Bakugo's heaving and the breeze around them, it was almost difficult to hear the soft-spoken words that began to tumble from the disciple of All Might. I get it now. It was because I stood for everything that opposed you, wasn't it? It was proof that you might be wrong. I was the outlier in the equation that you thought you had figured out. Every time I tried to save you, it was me looking down on you, because I shouldn't be able to save anyone. Was that it? It wasn't just because I was quirkless. It was because everyone told you that you could do it. And by my intervention, I was doing it, and you weren't. Does that seem right? I don't fucking know, Bakugo hissed. I don't know. But he did know. And they both knew that. The moment that Bakugo broke their staring contest, it became painfully obvious to the both of them. The guilt, the shame, the pain, it all stemmed from the both of their knowledge. They had a toxic history. And there was no repairing that. There was no ignoring it either. So many people had tried to overlook it, in favor of Bakugo's glimmering future. What was one quirkless kid in the eyes of history? Bakugo had tried to get rid of that problem by berating it, and beating it, so that it would hopefully fade. He tried to push it away, and break its spirit. When the only exception to his reality was removed, he'd finally be at peace with his potential. The world, the people around him, would be right. And Midoriya had tried to cover the problem by apologizing. By pretending it was everyone else's fault. It couldn't be Kaken's fault. He was going to be a hero. He wanted to be a hero. And that made it okay to the boy who once saw the spiky-haired blonde as the closest thing to All Might. He was inspired by Bakugo to become a hero, despite not realizing that his attempts at becoming a hero were literally proving everyone in Bakugo's life wrong. He was a walking antithesis. You kept getting up. You kept on trying. And my shitty brain thought win. Be a hero and fucking win. Take a nosedive off the roof, and hope for a quirk in your next lifetime. And now All Might is retired, and I don't think I was ever right. But if I'm not right, then what the fuck am I doing here? The thud that echoed through the street was the sound of meat striking meat, a soft, dull, but slapping sound as Bakugo staggered backward, clutching his face. His eyes were wide, staring at Midoriya with complete shock written across his face. Slowly, he withdrew his hand, letting it fall limply to his side, as both parties processed what, exactly, had transpired. Don't you go doubting yourself? It was the same as when they'd fought All Might. The same as when Bakugo had chosen to lose at All Might's hand, versus simply attempting to cooperate. And, for some reason, a reason Midoriya would never be able to place, there was something that made Midoriya have to act when he saw his old bully in this state. It's because I thought you were once so amazing. Biokinetic electricity began jumping from Midoriya's skin, his clothes starting to tremble under the collection of power and energy. His eyes grew narrow, the emerald depths becoming increasingly bright as the energy danced around his face, and he dropped into a fighting stance. Bakugo's eyes grew wide as he quickly shifted into a defensive position, preparing himself for another assault. This time, though, the speed was significantly different. It wasn't the same as earlier, where Bakugo had driven the pace. Nor was it the same as when Gran Torino had helped Izuku unlock the 5% continuous access to One for All. This time, it was Midoriya dictating the speed. He began racing forward, determination and passion plastered on his face as he prepared an axe kick, powered by more than his usual 5%. He brought his leg up, eyes wild with emotion. That I always chased you. Heavily, he brought it down, striking Bakugo's crossed arms with a heavy smack, nearly breaking the blonde boy's guard. He was sent sliding backward, but remained on his feet, continuing to shield his face from any possible follow-up attack. "You passed me?" Bakugo hissed, breathing in raggedly, feeling the drain from his earlier attacks. There was an ache that resounded through his arms as he cocked them back, hands tense and ready to detonate at a moment's notice, but he paid the sensation little mind. His attention, his entire being, was solely focused on the relentless rush of the jade-eyed hero in front of him. Midoriya didn't bother with words, there was too much to say, yet nothing that came out. His brain had taken a seat firmly behind his heart, and now, the damaged emotions that the boy had been dealing with for years was coming out wave after wave. Like a storm battering tirelessly against a wall, the cracks that had once detailed the walls began giving way to the maelstrom behind, resulting in the onslaught of emotion. For Midoriya, he had no longer any idea of what he felt. There was a tumultuous roar of thoughts that echoed through his skull, each shot silencing the others, yet coaxing them louder at the same time. Rage mixed with regret, while sorrow fused with confusion, all of which leaked into every single attack he threw. A stray explosion knocked Midoriya off of his center of balance, though he quickly recovered with a tight spin, followed by the extension of his leg. Narrowly, Bakugo dodged, and pressed an explosion forth desperately to counter the attack. The resulting explosion drew a sharp cry from Midoriya as his vision turned momentarily white, and he was sent forcefully backward. Smoke trailed from his clothes, though he recovered in an instant, landing squarely in a squat, powering his lunge forward. Electricity danced dangerously along his body, eagerly licking the pavement around him, serving as the only marker of where the boy was versus where he had been. "I've chased after you for so long. Don't tell me you were going in the wrong direction." There were many ways Midoriya knew his comment could be taken. And, in another time when his mind was much more clear, he would probably realize it was hardly concise like he desired to be. But his brain was the concise part of his body, not his heart. And his heart had to make it known. He didn't hate Bakugo. He hated what Bakugo did. He hated the things he said. The people he'd berated along the way to becoming a hero. He hated the things that Bakugo got away with. He hated how the boy's path was obscured by his pedigree, instead of defined by his actions. He hated that he'd once contributed to it. He'd fed into Katsuki's massive ego complex, driving him further down a path of identity crisis. But in the end, he knew it was on Bakugo's shoulders. And if there was one thing he hated above all else, beyond anything that anyone had done to him, he hated that Bakugo hadn't truly apologized. That's why, when he leapt into the air, with his teeth grit and his leg poised forward for a simple strike, he felt the bubble of frustration finally reach its pinnacle. There may not have truly needed to be a winner in the fight. In fact, neither party was fighting for their pride or their right to be at UA. They were fighting for their feelings. They were fighting to express their feelings. Because, for the first time, Bakugo truly understood what Midoriya felt. The nasty, cold sensation of regret returned once more, as he watched Midoriya sail above him, drawing closer and closer, as if in slow motion. Maybe it was because he was blindsided by the sudden rush of emotions he was forced to cope with, or maybe it was his uncertainty, but when Bakugo used an explosion to propel himself forward, he did so without a clear conscience, for what was the first time since truly entering UA, and he missed Midoriya's clenched fist drawn back. Fist met face, and the world for both Bakugo and Midoriya came to a crashing halt. They fell, together, and when the dust settled, Midoriya was on top, gasping, with a defiant look on his face. "You're not the wrong type of hero, you're the wrong type of person." Bakugo heaved deeply, in and out, while staring Midoriya dead in the eye, unflinching. "Even with everything you said, I still stand. Even with everything you said, I'm All Might's disciple. Does this mean everything I ever thought is wrong?" Bakugo mumbled in a tone so unlike him. It almost made Midoriya wonder if he'd knocked something loose in the sandy-haired boy's skull. No. A new voice spoke, much deeper than either Midoriya or Bakugo. Both teens, scratched, bruised and beaten up, quickly turned to the intruder on their fight, panic and shock evident on their faces. A blond man emerged from the safety of an ally, his sunken eyes betraying any emotions he was feeling. "It's not wrong to consider yourself powerful. You, young Bakugo, do have a powerful quirk. And you do have potential to become a great hero." Both teens were quiet, sensing there was still more to All Might's response. "But you have many shackles that will prevent you from ever fully realizing your potential. Your history does not simply fade, the words, the actions you've taken will always follow you. The past, sad to say, does not remain in the past." Neither boy needed to speak. They both knew All Might's words to be true. Midoriya especially. It had all started with one innocent talk, one moment, of which he felt vulnerable. He'd never imagined that he'd accidentally start a chain reaction that would result in the brawl the two had just shared. Perhaps, in another universe, they'd fight regardless, but in that world, there'd be much different feelings involved. There was no going back. There never was that option, and from the moment that Bakugo had uttered those fateful words only a few months ago, they'd been prepared to haunt him for every step he tried to take forward. No matter whether he forgot them or not, the truth was that Midoriya wouldn't. Even after their fight and his win, Bakugo knew that the green-haired teenager would likely never let go of the feelings he'd experienced during his childhood. What the fuck have I done? No matter how much therapy he went to, no matter who he spoke to, no matter who Midoriya befriended and laughed with, there would never be anything that could erase the damage that had been willingly inflicted. It made Bakugo sick to his stomach, knowing that he'd purposely targeted anyone, let alone a quirkless, defenseless boy. He wanted so badly to apologize, but the apology just didn't come to words. His heart, while willing, wasn't in it. It would be a reflex apology. A realization, if anything, but it would be devoid of the feeling that it truly needed and deserved. "You've made some terrible mistakes, young Bakugo. I am aware of your shared history," All Might said uneasily, gesturing to the duo uncomfortably. "While your escape was quiet, young Midoriya, somebody still saw you, and felt the need to come get me just in case. And judging by the outcome of your talk, it appears their fears weren't unfounded. Truthfully, I have no tolerance for bullying of any kind. And there's certainly no reason standing that you shouldn't be expelled. Aizawa isn't typically lenient, however, I believe reformation is a greater path than equal aggression, and clearly he believes so, too." Bakugo averted his gaze uneasily at the mention of expulsion. Midoriya's heart skipped a beat, distantly recognizing the close reality that had almost come to shape. Truthfully, he couldn't imagine a career in heroics without Bakugo setting pace. Whether or not they did it together didn't matter. They'd set out on their journey together. Even if they weren't upon the same wavelengths, they were upon the same destination. They shared the same end goal. They even shared the same inspiration. Their growth was in tandem, inspired by the successes of each other. With every step, they moved forward, challenging each other. Perhaps it was a toxic relationship, perhaps there was only decay in the fragile fibers of their friendship. But there was no denying the fact that their growth was intertwined, rightly or wrongly. All Might sighed. His age grew exponentially as he did so, reflected in his posture. Winning. Saving. They're both the same, They're all born from the same desire. To save someone, to win. They're the same coin, but different sides. Young Midoriya, All Might turned his attention to his successor. You believe saving is key to heroics. And you, young Bakugo, believe winning to be key to heroics. Together, you two are formidable, but to truly take the next step and understand of where you stand, you must learn to look in the world from the other's viewpoint. There will be fights you cannot win, but must still save those needing saving. And there will be those you cannot save without winning. Once you realize this, you will be a step further in your goals. All Might took a breath in. But first, you must come to terms with your relationship. And what must happen? Both teens exchanged a flicker of a glance at one another. Hot embers still fueled their earlier feud, though the fire was much tamer than it had been before. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second, before they looked back at All Might, uncertainty swirling on their faces. There was a moment of silence, before All Might realized they were waiting for answer. I can't tell you what comes next, that's for you two to determine. But that time to ponder will have to come later. Aizawa is waiting for you. Don't think for a second that he wasn't aware too. Midoriya paled slightly, and out of instinct, his gaze darted to P. Another transgression against the blonde was hardly a good thing. And yet, as his eyes fell on the teen, he was surprised to see a rather accepting expression adorning Bakugo's face. It was far from content, but it was equally far from angry, confusing the greenette. Come, face your punishment. And for both Midoriya and Bakugo, they knew they'd have to face the music at some point. Yet, for the both of them, they went silently, knowing that they'd found some answers in an otherwise humid night, but left with so many more. Cleaning duty. They were both stuck on cleaning duty. Honestly, both boys considered themselves immensely lucky. It was clear just by the look in Aizawa's tired eyes that he was debating a significantly harsher punishment. Yet, there was something holding him back. Though his jaw remained locked, and his gaze was like ice, he seemingly relented, and settled for whatever whisper of mercy he was provided. Without a second word, they both escaped the harsh glare of their homeroom teacher, and, though Bakugo would vehemently deny it, sighed in relief when they were free of the erasure hero. But as soon as the relief faded, they realized their state of solitude. And the tension came rushing back. While there was a lack of animosity, there was certainly a degree of hesitation in both teens, as they refused to look elsewhere. It was far too soon to discuss the details behind their fight, only a little bit had passed, really, and the wounds were both figuratively and literally fresh. For Midoriya, at least, he knew he had plenty to think about. And so, they walked up in the staircase awkwardly, trying to maintain a reasonable distance from each other, and finally when Midoriya reached his floor, he hastily made for the hallway. I shouldn't have done it. Midoriya paused mid-step, though he didn't dare look back. The courage he'd held all throughout their confrontation had worn off for some time, and he felt his fatigue. Knowing he'd have to serve a punishment for the next several days was only adding to his level of exhaustion. And now, he was so close to being free, and yet, he wanted to know. He wanted to know what Bakugo was thinking, what he had to say. Hell, he wanted to know what he'd thought about their fight, the first even fight they'd ever had. But his voice failed him. Maybe it was because he was tired, but nothing came up when he went to speak. I can't. Bakugo clicked his tongue. I've got a lot of shit to think about. Do you regret it? Midoriya finally asked. Truthfully, he wasn't sure if he was referring to their fight or their history. He decided he'd leave that interpretation up for Bakugo. There was a moment of silence, followed by a slow, single word. Yeah. Midoriya nodded to himself. It was far from satisfactory, but it was the barest form of a starting point he could ask for. And, like Bakugo had even said, there was a lot to think about. He, too, had plenty to consider, and with the days looking like they'd be full of solitude, there was plenty of time upcoming to think. Just as Midoriya took another step, he heard Bakugo one last time. To get knocked around, to get shoved down, but keep getting back up, heroes that don't give up must be pretty damn strong. Midoriya's eyes went wide. He turned around, to see no one. But as he turned back toward the path that led to his door, he felt his heart pounding harder than it had all night. Because for the first time since their childhood, The first time since Bakugo began to turn on him. It was no apology. It was far from enough. But it was the first time that Bakugo had outright referred to him as a hero. Maybe not the ending you were expecting? There's still plenty of stuff to deal with regarding the fallout. Bakugo's relationship with the class, as well as the bridging between Midoriya and Bakugo. And I think that there's a lot to still investigate with Midoriya's psyche, as well as Bakugo's. This will all be planned in a little sequel. Just a short, 4 to 5 chapter sequel. Or, I could continue it here. It doesn't matter which. Let me know what you think. I know this was pretty strongly based off canon. Sorry. Like I said, Horikoshi really did it well, and it's hard to break the best already. So a quick explanation of things. 1. I have been studying for grad school, which is why this chapter took so long. Sorry about that. 2. I already work in the ER, and with COVID, shit has been real. 3. Regarding the actual stuff, why did Midoriya win? Because Bakugo was distracted, simple enough. He wasn't fighting for the same reason in the manga. There's a lot different, and because it wasn't addressed, it's something that's going to be addressed later on. Bakugo and All Might still need their talk, and I already have that loosely planned. Guess I gotta add this part on, 'cause someone already reviewed complaining. Okay, why did Midoriya win? Let's count the ways. First, in the manga, Bakugo challenges Midoriya, knowing full well he plans to fight, one way or another. In this version, that is not the case. Secondly, Bakugo has already been training/venting his frustration by using his quirk as demonstrated on multiple occasions. Now, if I must go into how Bakugo has proven he can only launch a scale of 1 to 4 large explosions before suffering drawbacks, we can, but it suffice to point out he'd already been doing that. On a tertiary point, this Bakugo is dealing with significant guilt and frustration, the likes of which very easily cloud judgment. Have you ever hurt someone, and then they try to fight you? I have, sadly, and I can assure you that you're fighting them with a hell of a lot less power than you have accessible. And before someone says, oh, but Eve been in fight, congrats. I have too. I played ice hockey and unfortunately led my team in fighting major penalties for 2 years straight, before I realized I was dumb. But being tired and fighting someone fresh is almost grounds for a loss every time. Finally, and this is most important, the fight wasn't over. Yes, Midoriya had him down with a punch. You must not watch much into then, because you seriously think the fight is over? Horikoshi had a big picture to look at least 100 more chapters, wouldn't you say? We had very different outcomes for very different reasons. If you don't like it, do it better. I'm sure you can. Sorry, but had to address this before it started a war. I'm also probably cranky because I work 6 shifts a week and I have not been sleeping well at all, so I do apologize for the bite behind that. Hopefully this will end soon. But to those in deployment that are away from their families for so long, I truly respect your fortitude, because it is not easy. How you do it is beyond me. I gotta isolate for them. Anyways, yeah, everyone please stay safe and take care of yourself.